kind of insistence on the importance of your feelings and your experience of life to be childish, right? We hear this distinction about childish versus childlike, and it has to do with the value judgment that we place on those receptive, aware qualities of childhood. And to Banausoi, it's childish because their whole thing is that they've extracted themselves from their childhood and become what they think of as adults. But of course, as Hegel teaches us, and as we've talked about in these seminars, the side effect of that is that in the process of abstracting themselves, they lose touch with the things that matter to them. They lose touch with their feelings. They lose touch with their tangible, concrete experience of life. And as a result of that, it's easy for them to lose touch with the deep principles of nature that should be guiding our approach to justice and ethics and epistemology and everything else. So part of what an Aristos is doing, and I'll call on you just a second, Joseph, is that and Aristos is trying to bring back those valuable qualities that are lost in the Banausification of the personality, and to put them together into a new whole, so that the two sides of the mind are working together. But part of the result of that is that Aristoi often have a great deal of uncertainty and vulnerability and sometimes kind of open making of mistakes that's really easy to dismiss if you come at it from a Banausic noetic perspective, childish versus childlike. So today I was reminded of that when a friend made a quote and I didn't know what it was and I had to go look it up. And he said, "Stay golden, pony boy." How many of you have heard that?
Yeah, that's
Stay
from
golden,
The
pony boy.
Outsiders.
Yes, it's from The Outsiders, a book and a film. It's a quote in it, and in that book and in that film, it's a reference beyond. It's a reference to a Robert Frost poem that I thought I would share today because it's about the preservation of innocence and creativity and emotional vulnerability. So I'm going to look that up and I'll post it in the chat while I call on Joseph, and so Joseph can go while I'm pulling up the reference.
I was just basically going to make a really quick comment about being childlike. Is that the value in that is that you don't create boundaries and barriers that society puts on you. So it allows you to see things as the whole. And that's a really important concept, that being childlike is that we have these, and there's an interesting example that I've seen in yoga studios many times, that a child can go ahead and do a handstand and do these things without even thinking about them. And sometimes, adults have to work back to them doing a handstand and things like that. Not that they're not capable, but there's this like boundary that they have to get through that they've almost created mentally. And it's an interesting an example, but if you think about people like the book Walden, forgive me.
By Thoreau.
Thoreau. He went out into nature to deprogram himself. In a way, that's kind of what becoming childlike is that you're going into nature and you're kind of deconstructing all the things that society's told you that are necessary. And that's a good example, I thought, of being childlike. I think that's a really important concept, because many times in trying to get through some past traumas myself, I'm trying to get back to that childlike way of thinking and not create boundaries for myself. And that's something. And yeah, that childish versus childlike is a really important distinction to make.
Thank you, Joseph. Marianne and then Phil.
I'm still trying to puzzle over the question Sharon made a couple weeks ago about, seeing people good or evil. And I definitely have decided that it is situational. Like in Norway, they can have their strollers out on the street, run an errand, and the baby's still there. But the question I realized too was it age related? And then I think of Anne Frank. And Anne Frank had the ability to say in the most wretched time that she thought people were good.
That's potent. Thank you, Marianne. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I was, when you were making a comment about childlike, I was thinking of actually slightly differently.
Yeah.
And that has to do with whether you're single-minded or whether you're multidimensional. I learned this when I went to a lecture on language given by, I don't know if it was a linguist, but he saw two different way of seeing language as very, very different. And one was the more modern way, scientifically, by definition, the dictionary, like the example was, well, we know what a bird is. A bird has got wings, it got feathers, it flies, it roosts, it lays eggs and all that kind of stuff. And you list all these qualities which create the identity of the bird, and then you know what a bird is. And he said, well, that's one way of seeing it. But he said that there's another way of seeing it, which is sort of like a different approach, which is kind of much more metaphoric and poetic. And he said, in fact, how you see a bird is the bird has wings, but so do airplanes. So do many other things. And that's a connectedness. And then, it flies, many other things fly, it lays egg. There are things that lay egg and all this. So then you get this web of understanding that's connected in a way that's sort of like much more multidimensional, in some ways, partly mysterious and partly holistic. And he said, in fact, when you see things that way, what you find is that what you thought was a bird, there was nothing in the bird itself without its relationship to airplanes and other things. So the bird become real because it has all the supporting field of information that passes it. And I think that is a poetic way of looking at things. And I think that's why poetry is falling further and further behind in our society, because we now look at, we now look it up in the dictionary. We get in an argument, you look at a dictionary, this is what it means, like what it is, and we don't understand that, in a sense, the meaning always grows as the understanding expands and you have other metaphors. As an example, I always say, I still think of a whale as a fish. Now, I know a whale is not a fish, but on the other hand, I see a relationship. Okay, so I could switch back and forth, but you have to understand that there's another thing, which really comes back to being and nothingness, right?
Yes.
That identity and difference, but the difference itself informs the identity. And if you don't know that, then you're stuck with like, oh, this is irrelevant. Then you think of like a detective say, oh, like the cigarette, that's irrelevant. The information that you get to the path, what all of it has some effect. So
Yeah.
I don't think of that as childish. I think that is like a very authentic way of seeing the world as interconnected through layers of understanding.
Yes. The information out of context is noise. That meaning arises from context. It's from being immersed in things and comparing and contrasting that we learn what things are. Whereas
we're beginning to understand that with ecology, right? Because part of even the university system and the way business is set up and everything is set up, you have these silos of definition and information, right? And now we begin to understand that is not working as well. So one way to compromise that to a certain degree is, I've always argued when I taught in a certain department, is like we ought to develop ambassadors to other departments. So relationship, right? Maybe you don't quite want to go to the point like we'll just dissolve departments. Everybody is very creative and interact, which is sort of like what art was, what painting was, what art was in the 1960s and 70s. Like a lot of creative people went into it because like that was a place that was freer. And so in some sense, in the 1970s, when I was going and I was majoring in painting, it was difficult to be a painter because painting was, in a sense, dead, was consumed by all this other information, right? But then it reemerged. So if you don't want to quite go that far and have a mix of modernist silos as well as this more diverse thing, then I think ambassadors is a good, at least, way of interacting between these different silos so they communicate, kind of like the UN.
Thank you, Phil. Go ahead, Marianne.
So when Phil was talking, I realized that there was this major insight in the environmental movement where you say you want to save a species going extinct, but then now people are thinking you have to save the microcosm where this species exists.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yes. And if you do that, then the species will thrive. Right. Right. People talk about, maybe we're close to being able to bring back the mammoth. Jurassic Park style. We've got enough DNA now. We could do it. And all I can think is, but where are you going to put them? Since you're taking away the land already from the megafauna we already have, you need to create the context for the mammoth if you want to have the mammoth. Just like if we want to keep having snow leopards and giraffes, we need to, preserve the context that they need. The larger nature that they're immersed in and part of. And this gets back to, when we talk about this Begriff versus Verstand versus Vernunft view of the world, are we immersed in and integrated with a larger world, both nature outside us and within us, or are we separate from it? And are those just our tools and our pantry that we take and use? Because we think we're separate from the world and above it. This kind of schematizing, abstractivizing, discrete mathematicizing is inherent in the colonizer worldview, as distinct from the indigenous worldview. So, the point of the indigenous worldview is that an indigenous person is indigenous to a place or a set of places, and that those places are necessary to them, and that their religion, their art, their clothing, their food, everything about their lives is directly related to that place. And that as a result, they know that place, and they can not only be served by the place, but they can also serve it in turn and help it to thrive. So that the longer they're there, the richer and healthier the nature is in that place. And that's core to being indigenous. And the reason it's core is because any culture for whom that wasn't core would have died out hundreds of thousands of years ago throughout the evolution of humanity. It's only the ones that have figured out that, they have to be a blessing to the place that they're in and not just a user of it, that are able to still be there after tens of thousands of years. And I know, indigenous people are moving around. There's migratory types, there's pastoral types, but nevertheless, even the ones who move from place to place have to have that kind of relationship to the different places they move through in order to be able to keep those migrations going over the long term. So what you see in colonizer culture is the Verstand approach of saying, well, instead of drawing connections, let's draw boundaries. And each thing will be defined in isolation as a monad, a Cartesian monad unto itself. Man is a featherless biped, says Plato. He's trying to come up with this minimalist definition that is eternally true, which Diogenes is prepared to mock by plucking a chicken and throwing it at him. So, the thing is, if we think in those terms, then to us, we can't be connected to the land. We can't be connected to each other. We can't be connected to our past. We each have to be isolated individual things that relate to each other voluntarily through the exercise of our will, according to the protocols and systems that we establish for ourselves using our intellect. And so there's a whole worldview that unfolds just from the decision to, well, not even if it is a decision, just from the fact that we have evolved into thinking that way, because we think in a Verstand way. A colonizer culture is a logical outcome of that mode of thought. It's what's most consistent. It's what suggests itself to the world, that we be abstracted from the world, and then because we're abstracted, we evidently don't need it, right? We don't need anything. We're all individuals, so we can just use it and leave the problems to somebody else, which is the premise of colonizer culture, that things exist to exploit for our benefit. So it's interesting how this is one of the things that Kenneth Smith does, is the way he takes what people think of as, following up on Phil's comment about the different, disciplines within academia. We subdivide philosophy. We say, well, ethics is over here and epistemology is over there. There's ontology, and let none of this talk about politics. That's over there, right? That's something different. We don't want to mussy, up our pure little categories that please us so intellectually. And of course, Kenneth's very first words, almost in any essay, is to immediately begin putting the peanut butter in the chocolate in the peanut butter, in order to say, well, actually, in nature, all things are interconnected and part of a whole. So let's put the pieces back together. And it's how you get this kind of rich, fertile political commentary immediately injected into almost any theoretically abstract question that Kenneth turns his hand to, which is what we're going to see tomorrow night when he tackles Kant. And in theory, we're talking about epistemology, but in practice, it's going to go right to the politics and history of the world and colonization and all this other stuff. It's all related, because we're part of nature. We're part of a whole. The way the child sees the world, not the way the abstracted, civilized adult sees the world. So, with that out of the way, this is what I was thinking about when I saw my friend post the thing about "Stay Golden, Pony Boy," and I'm like, "What's that?" And I had to look it up. And
Go ahead, make one more brief comment.
sure,
I mean,
please.
in a sense, when you're destroying the environment, there's a diabolical way of thinking about it, because go ahead and kill the ostrich. Go ahead and kill whatever. We got the data bank. And like the woolly mammoth, we could always bring it back. I mean, you see how that got. But on the other hand, you can't bring back the whole environment, right? So you have this isolated, which is still a kind of like silo. Yeah, we could always revive it. So we could play God in a sense, right?
Yeah, exactly. We start to get it's a fulfillment of what the ego most wants, is to be God, right? To say that I can abstract everything to the point that I can control it, and then because I can control it, it is then ethically mine to dispose of, because I have the capacity. There's a might makes right kind of savagery built in at the basal level of this kind of Verstand thinking that goes unexamined. Just when Verstand is patting itself on the head for how civilized and rational it is, it's simultaneously becoming a regime of ego, of will, which now has the capacity to control using these abstracted systems, and has the emotional capacity to do terrible things as long as they are abstracted away out of sight. Right, marginalized people are the ones who bear the brunt of the pollution or the sweatshop labor or what have you, and they're marginalized because they're moved out of the spotlight, so we don't have to think about them. And thus, we're able to abstract ourselves and imagine that we're living in the best of all possible worlds, while simultaneously doing terrible things, and just everything goes into its little compartment, and we don't think about the compartments that are untidy or not done or not nice. Richard, go ahead.
Sorry. I was kind of looking for, I guess, whether there be an opportunity to kind of bring something into discussion, which I recently looked into more detail about. It's kind of disturbing, so I'll kind of just give people a warning. And possibly, I guess that was the opening, what you just said. So, okay. Sharon. So last week, talking about just sort of this mode of Verstand and abstraction. And then also, our discussions of the Procrustean bed. Sharon, you might find this partly interesting. Like last week, we were this is when you were gone during your call. I was talking about an Adam Curtis documentary. This one's from The Trap, where they're talking about metrics. And how they kind of basically, they kind of freed all these managers and middle managers as kind of like entrepreneurs to go and, removed all limits to go and figure out how to meet these metrics. And in the National Health Service in UK, you led to all sorts of goofy things like, in order to bring wait times down, they basically, created like a greeting nurse, which was not really a medical personnel, but was basically someone who would just sign you in, and that way they could kind of reduce their waiting times. We talked about like how in the operating, like for scheduling operations, separately they would find out like, what your vacation times were, and then they would subsequently schedule your operations during that, so that you wouldn't be able to make it, and then they would be able to say like, oh, they're off the list. But kind of like, I guess more specific to the Procrustean bed and kind of, so they there's kind of I guess in the waiting to be treated, like people were waiting in, I think they call them trolleys, like stretchers, like on wheels. So in order to kind of bring down that list, they basically just removed the wheels. Which is, and then like they would reclassify like corridors as wards and all sorts of kind of basic mental gymnastics, kind of vis-a-vis like Procrustean bed. Kind of the more disturbing thing I was looking into is Adam Curtis's next major documentary series after The Trap, which is All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, which is in reference to a poem, and basically talking about kind of how like we've all just become kind of slave to numbers. And one of the episodes talks of the colonial presence, the West colonial presence in Rwanda and also in Congo, especially like Leopold's reign over the Free Congo state is particularly notorious. And I'd heard obliquely about the atrocities, but I didn't realize sort of the system of perverse incentives. So they were harvesting wild rubber from the Congo, and this was like a big boom, like for like bicycles, and at this point like non-factory automobiles, so like kind of like rich automobiles that were kind of still made like kind of handmade in Europe and whatnot. And like I'm sure people have known about like like they've seen pictures of people or children in the Congo with their hands cut off, as a form of punishment. But it was actually systematized, and it created this really perverse incentive in that like they would subdivide like these different administrators to collect the quotas from different villages, and if you didn't meet the quota, you would have to make up the balance in showing that you were disciplining the people. By disciplining the people, and potentially by shooting them, and because bullets were expensive and they were imported in from Europe, the officers required that like the troops would have to bring in the hand for each person they shot so they could make up the balance. And eventually what this became is the hands themselves became a form of perverse currency. Like the troops sometimes like they would just go out and harvest hands, or the villager or some of the villagers themselves like in like worry that they would become victim to this because they didn't make their quota. They would attack and raid other villages and collect hands, so that they could make their quota. And I don't know, it's just like I've known of some of these atrocities, but I guess like having like understanding how this kind of fit within this bureaucratic system, it was just sort of kind of this absurdist horror and absurdity that I guess, yeah.
It's Kafkaesque, isn't it?
Yes.
The idea that people could lose track of the principles that matter, that they would engage in a currency of hands. At first sounds impossible. It sounds ludicrous. You wouldn't buy it in a story, and yet it really happened because there's something about the noetic side of the mind such that if you abstract yourself far enough from your feelings, the feelings of others and the nature that you're in, you can conclude anything with the right premises. It's one of Kenneth Smith's critiques of intellectualism. He says, we talk about how great it is to be rational. He says, but reason is not enough because reason by itself, given the right premises, can reach literally any conclusion. And if you're making your decisions strictly rationally, then it means the only thing standing between you and a Holocaust is whether or not you accidentally stumble on the wrong premises. And if you do, suddenly you're a menace to everybody around you.
Well,
Sharon, go ahead. And then Phil.
Well, I just wanted to, what I hear you saying, Richard, is you're talking about how systems try to measure efficiency by some metrics that are abhorrent and sometimes unattainable. And I just want to say in healthcare, there's a term that I use because I did go to business school too. It's called the McDonaldization of medicine. And we struggled with that. And in my territory, in the operating room, it was a process, moving the cases along. Total hip was supposed to take 1 hour, right? And so you book that many cases for the day based on this time. But what if it took 4 hours? You get in there, and this is the human body, and it's variation, and there are complications, and there's bleeding, and there are all kinds of consequences that happen. So what we had constantly was a metric that fell out. And when you had the committee meetings, the person who had the most metrics, which were outside the system, was called upon. And then it created quite a bit of discord because you were not engaging, you were not identifying, or shall I say, utilizing the morbidity of the patients, of the people in which you're measuring. So those metrics went out the window, right? And we had to find other measures to measure the efficiency of the system, and measures that were dedicated or were aligned with our particular specialty. Now, the hands, the story that you gave in Rwanda, that's really very cruel. And I think you find it in all kinds of societies when you get focused on the goal and not the process.
Right. There's a disconnect involved.
Yes.
Thank you for that. Phil, and then Joseph.
Yeah, what I find even more disturbing is beyond the abhorrence of the cruelty, is that the system, because individuals, we all have a capacity for creativity, are in a sense forced into a structure in which they create, the force to be creative in a perverse system, so that therefore, in a sense, you're put in a position to be creative enough to go collect a hand from somebody, or else your hand will be collected, right? That is actually more perverse, because now instead of using your creativity to produce something that is useful or good, you're now playing in the system in order to avoid being victimized. So I see that this whole thing about the ghetto, and you have all these drug dealers, right? You have a system in which you're restricted in such a way that you're forced to be creative within the system itself. And so therefore you come in, look at these criminals, these gangsters, these hoodlums. And it's like, no, it's a system, and you're forcing them to be creative in order to not be the victim or be less of a victim. And so that to me is wasting human potential beyond the cruelty. I mean, that is part of what was institutionalized in this particular case I mentioned, institutionalized racism, that we don't see it. We just then blame the hoodlum, but in fact, it's the system itself.
Right. We've built a system that has these perverse incentives. And because the perverse incentives are based on somebody attempting to fix a problem by imposing their will through, a limbic means with punishments, it creates, what they thought was going to lead them to their goals has consequences that they didn't think of. And this is Gödel's theorem all over again, right? They thought that they could design a perfect system of with enough beatings, people will be good. And instead, they create a system that creates side effects of people trying to avoid that circumstance that can generate horrors. It becomes creative in a diabolical way instead of in a healing way. Joseph, and then Marianne.
Yeah, I mean there are two kind of things here that I'm taking away, but I mean Rick, what you really highlighted was the limits of rationalism, really beautifully just a few moments ago. I mean, this is an example of this to the extreme. But there's a second part about it. It's not only the perverted incentives, but it's also, in this case, it's not a degree of abstraction with the hands, but there are things like money that create degrees of abstraction, but you're basically ruining somebody's life by, like, let's just say, wiping out their retirements, or their pensions or things like that. There's these degrees. You're really, taking everything that a person has worked for their entire life. So it's the degree, and there is an abstraction even with the hand. You're not seeing the child itself, right? You're just seeing the hand. And this is why the logic of it by itself, the rationalization limits on rationalization, you can rationalize, well, this place has to go bankrupt, or this place has to do this, but if you don't live by something else outside of, the metrics or that we're now discussing, then the consequences, become absolutely catastrophic in certain cases, because you can rationalize anything.
Yeah.
It really is as about as terrifying as you could possibly, it's as terrifying as anything as you can think of, because the idea of how you get to a Holocaust on your premises just being wrong, it's there. It's why a higher degree of ethics is absolute and is needed, but degrees of abstraction as well is really important in this process too, is to, like, not abstract. It's these aren't just numbers, and these aren't just metrics. There's something much more.
Yes, you see some of this fierceness of the pushback when you get Hegel, who writes these long, convoluted sentences, but when it comes time to criticize abstraction, he doesn't mince words. He says, to abstract is to be an error, period. The whole is the truth, period. I mean, he's just like, he will make these short Heraclitean pronouncements going after Verstand and trying to expose how dangerous it is. And yet generations after generations of readers will read Hegel and not get why he's being so forceful on this particular point, because we're so immersed in a modernist abstractivizing culture that we almost can't conceive of criticizing reason. It sounds unreasonable. And to us, being reasonable and reasoning are inherently pure good things. And so they can't be criticized. And so when people try to criticize them, we shrug off the criticism as, oh, they're just crazy, or they're just angry, or they mean something slightly different, or we can't actually let human reason itself stay right in the crosshairs of our criticism without our mind that has been so acculturated to love abstract reason, without it sort of wriggling and shuddering and shifting it out of the way, the Procrustean bed in action to avoid the criticism landing home, even when it's due, even when it couldn't be any plainer than to abstract is to be an error. It's just like, pow, right to the nose. And yet we move the face of abstraction out of the way to make sure that the blow doesn't land, because we're like, no, not our beautiful intellect. We love our intellect. Marianne and then Kat.
I was wondering what a universal basic income would do to this equation. Would people become more compassionate?
Yeah, this is what Robert Axelrod says is when you study human behavior and you study what allows people to cooperate and what gets in the way of their cooperation, when people are driven into a limbic mode, they can't cooperate anymore. Most of them stop cooperating. Even people who a moment before were incredibly helpful and kind and thoughtful and empathetic, when their survival is at stake, when they're threatened, the limbic switch in the brain flips over. For many people, it flips over, and now they're in a survival mode. And for us to have tried to create an entire civilization in which the engine of the economy is, on the one hand, desire and what do you want, and on the other, work or you'll be homeless, you'll die, you'll lose years off your life, and furthermore, your health span will be diminished because you'll spend many of those years sick out of poverty. What it does is it blocks us from engaging in cooperative behavior on a large scale. It keeps us perpetually stuck in the reptile brain, thinking about eat or be eaten, fight or flight, which I think someday there will be studies of that set of incentives effect on us as a world civilization that are as condemning of it as now when we look back at leaded gasoline and we say, what did it mean to put lead into the environment on such scales? Now that we know clearly that lead incites violence and an inability to control anger in human beings. How many people died just from high lead levels in the world, causing human beings to do things to each other they never would have done if they weren't being poisoned? And so the same goes with driving people into their limbic system. If you keep people permanently driven into their limbic system, what horrible things do they do to each other and the world that they never would have done if it hadn't been for the artificial constraints that we created? Kat, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute. You gotta come off of mute.
Thank you. I agree with what has been said almost in its entirety so far, but I see the system design as sort of folding in on itself to sustain itself, because everything is so compartmentalized unless you're autodidactic and studying multiple areas. Everybody is a professional in a certain compartmentalized area. And, we don't really talk to each other. So I see this, whether it's in linguistics or quantum mechanics or philosophy, if someone wants to have an original idea about physics and, it contradicts something that Einstein said, even though it's well documented that there has been mathematical errors in Einstein's general and special relativity, even though that's well documented, if it contrasts with that, they're afraid to submit those papers because it can be viewed drastically at some point in their career. I've actually seen this happen in real life. And the same thing, whether it crosses over with philosophy or English, if you don't maintain what has been done going all the way back to Plato in some cases, whether it's our way of doing education or the judicial system, it's almost like we're committed to maintaining this tradition as if we're obligated to people we've never met, thousands of years ago. So to me, it seems like the system is intentionally designed to sustain itself through compartmentalizing, because when you can't talk to each other and put together the pieces of the puzzle, you're just going to be an expert in that one particular situation without never getting the broader picture.
Boy, that's so important. Thank you, Kat. Yeah, and you see this in politics as well. Privilege versus marginalization. Half of it would only last so long as part of privilege is being blind to marginalization. And enormous numbers of people think that the world operates very differently than it does because they're inside of a cocoon. They've been compartmentalized and abstracted away from the things that in their everyday life they experience as food and clothing and so forth. They don't know where it comes from. They don't know what those people had to go through for it to be here at the prices that it's at, and for their life to be organized the way it is. So they're compartmentalized not only from other people who are suffering for their benefit and more for the benefit of the people who are extracting the excess profit, but they're even abstracted from the everyday actions they go through. The moment they put on their shirt, they're abstracted from where did that shirt come from? What did it cost somebody? What did they go through personally for this to be here? How about the color of that dye? Were there children somewhere, mining something that had to be processed for you to have that pretty color on your shirt? It's like one of the great powers of indigenous culture is that everyone is taught all the way back down to the ground where everything comes from. And so it eliminates this enormous stretches of abstraction from our own lives and reconnects us so that we actually know, okay, this is where a shirt comes from. You think about, people used to mock poor kids in New York in the 1980s for thinking that milk doesn't come from cows, it comes from the store. But how would they know any differently. And furthermore, even if a privileged person can say, well, I know milk comes from a cow, it's like, yeah, but do you know where your shirt came from? Do you know where the dye in it came from? How about look at your walls? Where did the paint come from? It's like, how many other people are bound up? Their fates are bound up in what you take for granted as normal. Maybe it's not normal at all, but you just can't see it because it's been separated and abstracted and compartmentalized so much to make the system go. Joseph, then Sharon.
I'm just going to make a very, very brief comment based on what Kat just said. And actually, when the idea that when a system is out of balance, it does fold in on itself. So kind of like, you're talking about our mindsets and how, when we're, Marianne was talking about the idea of universal basic income, when we have this, this thought that we just need, you're pushed into a point where you're in absolute need. Well, if the system is so imbalanced and you have people that are in that state where they're just reacting to the situations and they're unable to provide for themselves, the system's out of balance and it does fold in on itself. Like, people actually fold in on themselves. So this actually is true in physics. Like, if you even talk about the ideas of like tetrahedrons and all that stuff, but it also happens in systems theories too. Like, if you don't think about things as the whole, this is where it actually breaks down. And this is where wars come from and all these other things and unrest. So it's an interesting concept, if that was clear at all. I know I was a little bit abstract.
My turn? Yes, you are abstract. You're a little abstract, but so I want to make it practical. And I really believe that when you have a society of extreme privilege and marginalization, and the privileges are making the rules they have for the marginalized, then those rules sometimes appear very cruel. And it's not the intent, but they really do not understand how it is to live marginalized. Practical example, I volunteer with the Free Clinics of America. So my doubles partner lives in this neighborhood, the same neighborhood, but she's very different. So I invited her one day to come with me to the clinic, just for one day, just to sit and see the kind of people. And I'm looking to get into this free clinic, you probably have to make anywhere between $600 and $1,000 a month. That's how you get into the free clinic. And she came one day, and the second day I said, aren't you coming? She said, oh no, that's too hard. It's too much pain there. I can't do it. Because her world, she preferred the boundaries of her world, which kept her privilege, rather than to see and share somebody else's pain and enlarge herself. And this is to your point, Joseph, when you say, and this is why I think our society is in trouble. The system collapses and folds in on itself. And I think that's where we are.
Thank you, Sharon. Marianne, then Kat.
I agree with Sharon that I have friends that have disassociated through their happiness kind of index, and they all have to be so positive. And when she was saying that, I had started to read Christopher Alexander's Luminous Ground, and the big insight that I got from that was that sadness, like tears express the whole. And if we deny ourselves our ability to feel sad, we are missing out.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It might seem to be momentarily more comfortable to separate ourselves from the pain that's going on around us, like in the example that Sharon gave. But the cost of doing that isn't just abstracting ourselves from those people that we're pushing outside of our circle of empathy. It's also abstracting ourselves from being able to be whole people in the world, because some part of us should be sad at those circumstances. We're out of sync. We're not in harmony internally when we're not in harmony externally either. There's a relationship between the nature within us and the nature around us that is too easily overlooked the more we abstract ourselves from the world. Kat, go ahead. Oh, you're still on mute again.
I wanted to chime in because Sharon said something that really resonated with me. I live here in West Virginia, the beautiful state, almost heaven, West Virginia. And we have a senator here, and I'm sorry to insert politics, but it just resonated with me what she said. We have a senator here by the name of Joe Manchin. And it costs $10,000 to run for a Senate seat here in West Virginia. So the people, in my opinion, who should be running for office have a background similar to those as AOC, which was a bartender, or some people who have to really think about, you know, how am I going to pay all the bills and be able to afford to eat? They don't have $10,000 to run for office. You have these people who are well off, right, and do have the money to run for office. And when they do get into office, they help make laws, enact laws that they in turn sometimes help benefit their relatives. In the case of Joe Manchin, his daughter worked for a pharmaceutical, and he voted, sorry to insert politics, but it just resonated. And he voted against a cabinet nominee. In my opinion, it had to do something with her speaking out against his daughter. So you have these people who can afford to run for office, and then here is the system folding in on itself within the same stratosphere that he's on, right? His children, in this case, his daughter, who is a big head of a pharmaceutical company. And so it's almost as if they're enriching themselves, and the benefits never kind of goes down to where it really needs to be at lower levels. So it's interesting that the conversation came around to folding in on itself, because we literally had the last stimulus package held up by my senator in a state where it happens to be the oldest state, right? The oldest people and the most sickly state. And for some reason, he thinks it's a good idea to hold up a vote in a way that helps people who are more privileged. And I don't hate people who are privileged. Kudos to you if you made it there. But it seems to me the reason that the government was formed is for the people, not for big business. Despite what the courts say, as far as courts being defined as a person, it's not a homo sapien, right? My thought is governments were formed to benefit homo sapiens. So it's just interesting that she had mentioned something that just really resonated with me, how even within the government, if the system folds in on itself to continually help those who are at a certain echelon. And it's really hard to kind of get down to the lower levels of on that pyramid.
Thank you for that. Yeah, this way in which abstraction causes things to fold in on themselves and self-isolate and self-compartmentalize. You know, it's interesting when you put it together with Julius Caesar's comment, which is paraphrased as divide and conquer. But in the Gallic Wars, he never uses that phrase exactly, but he talks about the idea of divide and conquer in the Gallic Wars. And he flat out says that's how he beat people who otherwise could have repelled him. And the Roman army is he pitted them against each other and got them to separate. And once they were separated, they were easier to deal with. And so you can see how, you know, to the colonizing mind, to the imperializing mind, to the mind in search of power, dividing people up, you know, so that they don't unite against you is a potent tool, and making the people who would evoke sympathy invisible is a potent tool, because it's hard to unite with someone you don't know exists, that you don't know is suffering. But the problem is what everybody who uses these tools underestimates is the way that once you unleash the Verstand mind, the noetic mind, the systematizing mind, liberated from ethics, liberated from epistemology and ontology and the greater picture, what happens is it becomes a force unto itself. And when it's a force unto itself, it will engage in abstraction without your permission. And it will engage in compartmentalization and enfolding without your permission. And so the very people who are using these tools to attempt to control society for their own benefit are also unwittingly being separated off from the things that they need, that they don't know about, that they don't understand. There's this thing that Marx talks about. Kenneth Smith wrote a paper about Marx early on, which was really illuminating. It's a very non-Marxist paper about Marx. It pulls out a lot of things that Marx said, but that people don't quote. And one of the things that Marx said is that capitalism isn't about the bad guys oppressing the good guys. Capitalism is a system in which everybody only gets to be part of a person. And so some people get to be creative and engage with the world and make things with their hands or with their labor and see the effect on the world. And other people don't have to do any of that. They parasitize off of it by harvesting the excess capital. But the system gets its own momentum until it's not just that they don't have to do it, but that they can't do it. They're deprived of part of what's the essential human experience. They don't get to be full human beings because the process of living such an abstracted life where you can justify doing these things to other people is self-harming as well. You end up, being broken and creating a broken psychology, broken character, and broken families. You see this a lot in the ultra-rich families where there can be a lot of hatred towards one another, a lot of infighting where children will back away from the family and never engage with them again because they were being taught to be cold towards other people, and it backfired and turned into being cold towards each other and towards themselves and using themselves like resources the way they use other people. There's this way in which once the mind starts to engage in patterns of thought, it will do that unconsciously without your permission. And the things that come as a consequence of that go far beyond what you wanted to will into existence through your acts of ego. Richard, and then Sharon. And then Phil.
In response to Kat, and I think Rick, you and we've talked about this here in previous sessions that the government was founded for the people, but it depends on your reading on who the people are. So definitely they were not the slaves, but actually even beyond that, they were not even all the white people. They were the white people that had land, right? And, there were a lot of unwanted, and quote, white trash, so no, I'm not saying that to denigrate. I mean, there's actually a historical,
Okay.
People who didn't have property were treated that way by the founding fathers.
So we really still haven't fully come to reconcile that. And then just a side comment, in the chat, there's a bunch of discussion between Dave and Sharon about some Buddhist concepts, which I'm not. It was an interesting observation made by a philosopher. He's still alive. He's Slovenian, I think. Slavoj Žižek. I typed the name out. Slavoj.
Yeah, thank you.
Žižek. And he made quite an interesting claim that, late capitalism and the rise of Buddhism and mindfulness are it's kind of symbiotic in that mindfulness is almost kind of a way that those who are successful in this abstracted world, but that's full of atrocities and inequalities, are able to cope with our modern day horrors. So I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, there's a there's a tremendous need for therapy, not just for the proletariat, but for the bourgeoisie, because it's not healthy to behave in these ways and live lives in these ways, even if it's the path of least resistance for people with power to go along with it and to expand their power and to exploit others. It's still seriously damaging. It's one of the subtleties of Heraclitus. I keep coming back to the nature around us and within us over and over and over, because among the last holdouts that's hardest to break down in us, in our abstractiveness, is the understanding that the nature within us is in fact bound to and part of the nature around us. and vice versa, and that you can't be walking among horrors without them being reflected inside you. Even if you're not the recipient of those horrors, even if you're the perpetrator and you're largely insulated from them, they still change you internally. They affect your character and they affect your nature, whether you want them to or not, because you are bound by laws of nature that control your character every bit as much as they control your body. We're immersed in a larger thing, internally and externally. Sharon, and then Phil.
Well, I just wanted to follow up on something that you expressed very beautifully. The individual that abstracts and the impact it has on your personality. And that same friend is in the middle of the pandemic, and she says to me, she's white and she's fairly wealthy. Her husband's a big business executive. That's the profile. So she's at home all day. She says to me, "Well, Sharon, aren't you worried that you're going to get the virus?" I said, "No, why?" She says, "Because you're African American." I said, "Really?" And so I started to laugh at her, and then I stopped, because I recognized that she really didn't understand. So I explained to her about the social determinants of healthcare. And that conversation led to me inviting her to come with me to the clinic one day.
Yes.
To see how it is. And so I think you marginalize your humanity when you're privileged and you abstract yourself from the reality that's not as well-founded or well-healed as yours.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
The second thing that Richard just mentioned about Buddhism, I had the opportunity to visit Tibet. And that's a very, very poor country. But one of the things that I noticed that I was there was their devotion to their faith, which was Buddhism. You had prayer flags all over the town. Everybody had a prayer wheel. And when you looked on their faces, they were not sad. They were very happy. And it was quite an impoverished state. So I don't know if it was that you'd sit there, you see a guy sitting on the street and he was meditating. So that mindfulness to me seemed to have helped them manage the real severe challenges of everyday life. Granted, they had a short lifespan. They were 14,000 feet up. So, you only live till about 50 or 60, right? And, but it does have its place.
Excellent. Thank you, Sharon. That's an excellent point. That it's not that you'll sometimes see memes on the internet, but sometimes every day you'll see memes on the internet that talk about whether you're happy or not, whether your life is difficult or not, as being entirely under your control, which overstates the issue. But what you've described, I think, hits it on the head. That the character and orientation and culture bring an enormous amount to bear. Mm-hmm. Not everything, but an enormous amount to bear on our experience of life. And so, you can have people who are relatively well-adjusted and sane and healthy under poverty conditions, at the same time that you can have ultra wealthy people who are completely maladjusted and unhappy, mm-hmm. and they can't figure out why. Why aren't they fulfilled when they're following the recipe that society says this is what you do to succeed, and if you succeed, you'll be happy. You can just buy your happiness, right? Isn't that how it works? And the difficulty, the disconnect that comes from having a character that was so poorly acculturated, is something that has to be seen to be believed in order to break out of the programming that we get in this culture that keeps telling us that's the recipe. Get what you want and you'll be happy. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah. On the other hand, we don't want to go too far to slam abstraction either, because it seems to me you have to have both. I'll give you an example. When I was teaching in Milwaukee, I often drive through Chicago. I could either go the interstate, I-90 and down to 80 and back to Ohio. Well, I was like, one day I decided I'd drive locally. And of course, locally, that means I have to go through the North Shores to Chicago. and I see blocks and blocks and blocks, several blocks deep, of these just really expensive houses. And I remember commenting myself, my God, how many people have to die for this to be? And I'm certain that most of the people who in those houses have never asked that question, right? But on the other hand, because now I never went to the places where people die, so that was abstract thinking. There was also some concrete understanding, I suppose. I've seen people suffer. So it seems to me it took both for me to make that leap between this and, let's say, people in Indonesia or Malaysia are dying because of that, right? So so in a sense, you have to, in a modern world, because we do live in an abstract political world and all sorts of other things, you also have to need to understand that we also live in an abstract world, because I couldn't make that comment without it. All I could do is say, something is damn wrong here. I don't really get it. I mean, but to actually say, to make the connection that people had to die for this to be, I think took the fact that you understood sort of some humanity, but you also understand abstraction as well to make that connection. So we don't want to go too far and slam abstraction as like this totally horrible thing that we find useless, because it is useful in its proper place. That's my comment. Some reason I can't hear
Rick,
you.
I think you're.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute.
There you
Yeah, so just like that was a very good point, Phil. Thank you for bringing that up. It's interesting criticizing reason, because reason is so not used to being criticized that it will typically respond by turning the criticism up to 11 and saying, oh, you're just saying your rationalism is wonderful. It's like, well, that wasn't it. I was just saying, look at these things that reason can do. And reason's like, no, don't stop touching me. I'm perfect. I'm good. And so there's this tendency for both sides to over polarize as a result of those discussions, because you get this massive pushback and then it's hard to be nuanced in response to it. But the truth is that, the reason we have both sets of faculties, the reason they evolved in us, is because we need them both. They both have incredible power to help us. And what we have available to us in each one is inadequate, is part of where Hegel and Heraclitus and the others are going with this. It's that there is something in us that draws us to want to oversimplify and think that one or the other can be the strategy. You can't just live for the day, right? The way that so many memes and bumper stickers say, because then you don't plan your life, you don't prepare anything, and it tends to lead you to be parochial, to overemphasize your personal idiosyncratic experience. But you also can't just be abstract and all about academia and learning and knowledge, because then you will tend to, to distance yourself from the deep connection to reality that's necessary to and Diogenes' words, to leash reason, so that it becomes right reason. You need both of these faculties. So this is what's interesting about Hegel's critique, is that he goes beyond it just being concrete versus abstract. He pairs up concrete with particular. And that's where you can see both the strength and the weakness of Begriff, right? Because the Begriff is more parochial, because it's more about a specific thing. But it's also more in depth because it actually experiences that specific thing. It's not just somebody's idea of the specific thing. And so the concrete and the particular that are the Begriff experience, the infant's experience, the naive experience of life, the immersed pathos experience of life, has its weaknesses, but it has its powers too. The critique he has against Verstand, you can see it more clearly when he pairs up the abstract with the universal. Because the universal is an important thing. That's what makes you become cosmopolitan. It's what breaks you out of being parochial, that you can start to universalize beyond your own experience, beyond just your friends, your interests, your home, your feelings, your favorites. That I've posted this before. I'll post it again. Idiotia, one's own in the Greek. Idiotia. What makes one an idiot is that one is focused on one's own things, one's own preferences, one's own ideas, one's own family, one's own friends. There's a parochializing drive in us to prefer the family scent, if you will, of the things we're already familiar with. And we have to universalize to escape the trap that Begriff offers us. But the problem is that the natural first step for universalization is abstraction. And abstraction can become a force unto itself, so that we move into a world of abstract circumstances in which we universalize in ways that spread massive swaths of error and mistakes all over the place. And so what Hegel's telling us is that we need Begriff, we need Verstand, we need them in a shifting, healthy harmony with each other, with our internal world and with the world around us. But neither of them can provide that. Neither of them can be the master. Each of them kind of wants to, because they're sort of alien modes of thought, even though they're both in our brain at the same time, each of them sort of wants to have priority and say, well, you should listen to how you feel. No, you should listen to what you think and what you've been taught. But it's unresolvable as long as you stay within the one dimension of the struggle between the Begriff and the Verstand. They tend to polarize against each other, and all the compromise positions just have different mixes of weaknesses in them. There's the strong suit that we need to find to be healthy, whole human beings isn't anywhere to be found on that line. And so this is what Heraclitus said. This is what the archaic Greeks said. This is what Hegel says, although it doesn't get quoted very often. And this is what, follow-on people like Kierkegaard and Kenneth Smith say. They say there is a third mode of thought, but it has to be struggled for and done imperfectly and constructed out of the other two modes of thought. And it needs more than those two modes of thought nourishing it or giving it energy. You have to go outside of the head and you have to go into the world and let the world prove the limits of Begriff, that there's a bigger world out there than what we've experienced. And we also need the real world to prove the limits of Verstand, that the concrete reality that we live in is so different from the abstractions that we make our decisions according to. And that if we do that over time, we will discover not just a bunch of information, which we could file away in our Begriff or Verstand preferences, but deeper principles that can act like a compass to help us leash Begriff and leash Verstand and get them into harmony with each other and with the larger world. That idea that there's a direction to our agon and that the direction is to reach out beyond ourselves to those connections Phil talked about, instead of the boundaries, to the connections that put us into the context and help us to find our orientation. That's the corrective that Begriff and Verstand both need, but that neither of them can come up with on its own because it's ruled out by the Begriff mindset and it's ruled out by the Verstand mindset. It's only when we break out of that schism and we start to imagine a third possibility that we can imagine what he calls the concrete universal, where we can think beyond our parochial experience to a universal experience, but not in an abstract way, in a concrete way, where we can acknowledge that the things outside of our experience aren't obedient to our intellectual schemas about them, but have their own laws and their own rules, their own nature that other people know better than we do, and that we're going to have to work together to figure this stuff out. There's like this whole epistemology and an implied politics that comes out of it, buried here in Hegel, just kind of waiting for people to find it. We got quite the line here. So I think it's Kat, Marianne, Joseph, and then Phil.
Yeah.
So let's start with Kat.
I was just writing down my thoughts so I wouldn't forget. And I know I'm kind of going to the opposite side, but I agree with Phil's comment to a degree also. In my humble opinion, there is a necessity for abstraction because, in my view, the system abhors, right? It doesn't want new information. It wants to maintain itself, to sustain itself. And that kind of reminds me of the third law of thermodynamics. You don't want new information because it becomes something else. And I see that in the school system. I remember when I was in college, I wrote a paper and I was really feeling it. I had the stream of consciousness and I cited Little Kim, right? I grew up in Black culture. She's a rapper. And my English teacher just tore me to shreds. It broke my heart. And my confidence wasn't rebuilt until another professor nominated me to be a member of the English Society, right? So in her view, the first professor, it was just totally unacceptable to quote someone who in her mind was ghetto, right? It just wanted to maintain the way writing should be done according to MLK, and everything has to be nice and neat and proscribed in this one way. There is no creativity to be had, and you can change teachers, but the system is still there, right? It's still an institution no matter how many teachers come and go, and they're going to still maintain the same rules. So, in my opinion, it is important to be abstract, because when you are an agent of change, you're going to meet resistance. Sometimes it's necessary to provide new information by way of analogy, right? Somebody mentioned Buddhists. If you read Lotso, and I know I'm pronouncing his name wrong, sorry, they give you information in a way that is indirect, right? So you can gain knowledge through your own self-experience. To me, that's an abstraction. You're not directly, giving people information. I see that crossover in a way in physics too, with the waveform collapse. I know this is off the topic, but in a sentence, if you know it, right? The waveform collapse. So it has to be a way to give information without being sort of, the person who's taking all the arrows and the guns and the fire and the way that AOC has, right? I remember when I ran for office here in West Virginia in 2016, and I was like, no, weed needs to be legal. Too many people are getting locked up. We're wasting resources. And we can't do it. But now it's completely acceptable. And the governor is coming out and saying, we should make weed legal and no state taxes. And I'm like, okay, where was he at when I talked to him about it in 2016? Now it's do it. Now he's all for it. But I took all kinds of wildfire when I came out and said something about it in 2016. So maybe if I said it in an abstract, indirect way, maybe I would have taken less wildfire. I would love to learn how to be sublime, by the way. I've never learned that. I've never got that yet.
Thank you for that, Kat. It's illuminating. So, Marianne, Joseph, then Phil.
So when, Rick, you were saying that abstraction came first, I started to think of Leonard Swain and the alphabet and the goddess. And how I understand it was before we had a way to categorize things, we were much more right brain. And we would even be in magical thinking. Like if we created a building, we were recreating the universe. So I just had to add that.
Thank you for that.
Interesting.
Thank you for that. Joseph and then Phil. Oh, you're on mute, Joseph.
You answered my question when you were going over Vernunft. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, when you were talking about the relationship between that, I was thinking to myself something that I think is related. But I remember when I was in the process of doing art, I was still a student. At some point, I learned that making a mistake was somehow more important than not making a mistake, because it leads you into a new direction, because it gives you an opportunity, an opening into something else.
Yes.
So I thought, okay, that seemed like it might be kind of a universal law, maybe. So I thought, okay. So I realized that for a while, what I did was I painted and I purposely made mistakes because it would purposely give me openings into searching for others. And only after a while that I realized, no, that's also wrong, because that's not a real mistake.
Right.
It's honest mistake that is not authentic. So I had to kind of pull back and say, yes, mistakes are good, but they have to arise from the situation that's authentic. Making trouble in the wrong way so that you could have a way of creating an opening is too synthetic.
Yes.
so I think we have to understand that in a sense, sometimes your mind could purposely create these sort of somersaults in order for you to like get somewhere. And you have to avoid that. You have to let whatever your action is in relationship to another action that arises authentically. And that's why we have to kind of be in the world in order for that to happen, because that's authentic. When you're just sort of sitting back and thinking, I think I'm going to make a mistake. I'm going to start or whatever. I mean, it's like that's still an abstraction, okay? And now you're in a loop that you created for yourself. So I think it's important to understand that your mind has a way of almost trapping yourself, kind of like I said, you institutionalize a situation in order to create a thing, so you can live to be creative within that little situation. Now, this is the state imposing it upon you. You have imposed it on yourself because you thought that was a kind of universal law. But
Right. That's a great example, Phil. Thank you. Sharon, go ahead.
Phil, so you got to make mistakes, not intentionally, but unintentionally, because those mistakes give you experience. That experience gives you judgment, and that judgment gives you wisdom.
Yeah.
So it's a whole circle that is necessary for growth. I don't know how we got here, but that's how I see it.
Yeah, there's something potent in real natural mistakes, because they give you a way to mirror out where you can see it, something that's hidden inside of you that you didn't know was there. We don't know the consequences of our belief systems until we act them out in the world, and then we go, oh, well, that's not what I wanted. And then the mistake is organic and natural and inevitable. People talk about that with screenwriting. When you're trying to write a story, if the story is just a bunch of random things that happen to somebody, it might be momentarily diverting, but it's not meaningful. But when a story is a bunch of things that happen because of the choices the character made, and because those choices made sense to the character at the time, and they couldn't see the bigger picture of what was going to happen as a result, then suddenly we start to get connected. We're going, now this is a story, right? Because we've all been through that in life. That's like the experience of life, is doing what made sense to us and then going, wait, what? No, that's not what I wanted. And yet here it is. Marianne, go ahead.
So when Phil was talking about mistake leading to an opening, I felt, and then he said, well, it's not authentic. I felt that it helped me understand the rioters at the Capitol, because they were rioting in this. I don't know, but it did help me. So thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Marianne. Richard, go ahead.
I was like thinking like how terrible it is that like in our age right now, like helicopter parenting, is basically like avoiding people at a young age learning mistakes. And it's not necessarily in isolation, right? Because like our world is becoming such a winner take all type thing that like the cost of mistakes are becoming more costly. So like it creates a lack of of space to learn, like to make mistakes and to learn these lessons, and for people to be well adjusted, and to occasionally experiencing failure.
Yeah, it's why, even though I'm not a research scientist, I think of myself fundamentally as a scientist, is because I'm engaged in computer science for medical software. So one of the nice things about programming,
really?
Yeah. So one of the nice things about programming mission critical medical software is that your mistakes have a big impact. And so they matter. You can't just brush them off and say, well, it doesn't matter. It's like, well, no, I really shouldn't have let that guy prescribe that drug for that patient when we already knew he had a drug-drug interaction, right? So the mistake matters, and you have to pay attention to it. But also, because in so much of life, especially with other people's help and with your own mind's help, it's easy to erase your own mistakes and pretend they never happened, or that they weren't a big deal. I can say something stupid, and then in the next sentence, other people will say the thing I meant to say that they could tell that was what I was trying to say. And so we all move on to the statement that I should have made, and we leave behind the error I made, like when I said that Euripides was the source of the drop by drop wisdom is distilled from pain thing, right? That was wrong, right? And we all helped each other on over to Aeschylus. But when you're writing computer software, it has no imagination. It does literally what you tell it. So every mistake you make gets magnified into something that's visible before you and forces you to rethink, you know, what it was that you were doing. That feedback loop that's at the heart of science that says, okay, it's nice to have an idea, but you got to test it, is sort of inherent in any kind of mission critical software, because all your mistakes come back to haunt you. There's nowhere to hide. Dave, go ahead.
Richard, on your point about helicopter parenting, I read an article a few years ago. There's I think it's somewhere in Europe, I'll guess this, one of the Scandinavian countries, where during recess, they do not give the children any instructions or boundaries at all. And so if a child wants to climb a tree, the child is allowed to climb the tree. And what happens is, if the child falls out of the tree and breaks his leg, of course, you don't wish that on a child. And the parents at first were a little upset because these things were happening. But after a while, the parents came around and really became wildly supportive of the program, because it was really teaching these kids how to think for themselves, that there are consequences to their actions, and how to push themselves and when to know when to reel it back, allowing them to make their mistakes and develop their wisdom, just like we've all been talking about. It was a really powerful concept. So I'll look for that article and try to post it in chat.
Thank you, Dave. Sharon and then Phil.
So Richard and Dave, are either of you parents? No? Helicopter parenting is something that I discussed a lot with my colleagues. And I think helicopter parenting, having come from another culture, is something that you find in this culture. And it has to do with the way with our society and structure. When I was a kid, my mom would open the door and she said, "Come back before it gets dark." And that was it.
Same,
But
Sharon.
in this society here, you cannot do that because somebody might take that kid away. So it has to do with the boundaries of the society. Of course, you can go to the extreme where the child is told what to do and not allowed to make any mistakes, and then he doesn't learn. And then you get to young adulthood and you have a crisis. So everything has got to be in balance in the middle. But I want to say the conforms of this society leads to a kind of helicopter parenting. Because when I was raising my kid and he was 15, 16, I wanted to know where he was, particularly when he was behind the wheel of a car, you know, because it had consequences, big ones, and some of those mistakes would be irreversible.
Right. It reminds me a little bit of, you know, trying to overprotect the children so much they don't get to make their mistakes. It's almost like when you over-sterilize a ward at a hospital, and because of that, it leads to an explosive outbreak of a disease, right? That law of unintended consequences.
Yeah, Murphy's Law, the law of unintended consequences is just like the first thing we should teach in kindergarten to little kids. Welcome to the world. Lesson number 1, everything you do, other things are going to happen as a result. Phil and then Kat.
Yeah, this is responding to all of that. In a complex society, it's just, the consequences of making mistakes become more and more acute. My sister used to have a boyfriend back a while ago, maybe 15 years ago. And I come visit her, so I interacted with him a lot. He was a NASA engineer. Okay. So I had a little problem with my car. There was something about it. I forgot exactly what. It might have been startup. So, you know, I thought I would ask him for advice. I had some ideas of my own, but I asked him for advice. And we looked at it, and he checked it, some wiring, and he checked the fuse, and it started up. I said, well, that's it then, okay? No, not for him. No. He checked many things, and finally did turn out was the fuse, but he checked many other things. And I asked him, I sort of went back to my sisters, like your boyfriend, like, he's like overdoing it, isn't he? And then I talked to him about it. He said, the problem is that, when you're working on a Mars prober, you can't say like, okay, like that wasn't quite it. Let's bring it back so we could fix it. So every damn thing, like way beyond. That's an extreme example, but I think society has gotten so complex that it almost seems like you have, which means that by its own nature, the complexity of society itself creates a situation where you're less and less able to make mistakes. And so that avenue of, let's say, making mistake in order to create openings, new avenues of understanding becomes more and more prohibitive. So then it becomes like, so that's part of society itself. As Sharon says, I see it in my lifetime. I used to be, when I grew up, you did say, go out and come back by 5 o'clock or whatever, okay? And you assume that that's okay, and it was pretty much okay, particularly in your reasonably safe neighborhood. But nowadays, you worry about all sort of things. In LA, there was the freeway strangler. I mean, like, you never know. I mean, there's so many things in a complex society that you have to be a NASA scientist just in case, because there's so many things you don't know, and you can't bring the kid back and say, well, we'll fix this now. That's fine. So I lament that to a certain degree, because maybe in a way, school is the last place you could allow children to make mistakes, if we only understand that. But if school is going to reflect what society is about, then that's yet one less place to make a mistake.
Right. Thank you, Phil. Kat, then Marianne, then Sharon.
So I was kind of racking my head, and I was just thinking about, the boons and the banes of abstraction. And the last comment I made was, one of the great things about it is you get less resistance if you're an agent of change. But another thing that occurred to me, because you mentioned coding, is when you use abstraction, you can take advantage of the brevity, right? You can relay multiple concepts in a short, quick, easy to understand, and in often cases, layman's terms. That's why one of the greatest teachers that I've ever come across, and it's through YouTube video, is Richard Feynman, right? And he was a physicist explaining very difficult things, but he could almost explain it to a third grader because of the way he teaches it. And a lot of it is through abstraction. So I was just thinking about when you said coding, a lot of it is symbolism, and in a way that relates to abstraction, because you can relay, large quantities of information in a short space.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, when we look at the power that we're able to unleash to make change in the world through abstraction, you can see why it evolved in us, because it's given us the ability to change circumstances we couldn't change when we weren't, leveraging that part of our mentality enough. It's like many things, it makes a great servant but a really terrible master. Marianne, your turn.
When my daughter was young, she was coming back from the school bus, and a predator tried to intimidate her and snatch her. And because of that situation, I went to the police, and the police told me, this is Seattle, that you had to have 2 incidences of that before they would investigate, which I thought was horrendous. So I moved to a more isolated suburban kind of neighborhood, a lot safer. And then I think of city planning, and I think, like, if you think environmentally, you would want to increase the density. But if you think of safety, even with the pandemic, you think of spreading out. And I think there's a dilemma there.
Yeah, right. There's a major contradiction that we're struggling with, isn't there? Sharon, go ahead.
Can I just
mistakes, I think we have to categorize it. In my profession, no mistakes. That's it. No mistakes, no room for error. Near misses, but no mistakes. They're catastrophic. And you could tell from our malpractice premiums, they're sky high. So it's catastrophic. So mistakes in learning in life, and I think it's up to us as parents to create situations or give the child some latitude so that they can learn. And it's going to be supervised. It's going to be a little helicopterish, but that's what it is. But I just wanted to say that mistakes are situational. What you do, Rick, what I do, mistakes are not preferred.
What an understatement. Yes, that's right. That's right. And it's part of why in medicine and in medical software, there is this systematization that goes on, because if somebody is supposed to amputate your left leg and they accidentally amputate your right leg just because they didn't check, right? It's a preventable mistake. And it's the kind of thing where people say, why on earth wouldn't you have a checklist? Right?
Correct.
There should be some step where somebody writes on their leg, this is the one to cut off, right? And not this one, you know, and just a simple, you'd think it's sort of a trivial brain dead thing, but you know, that's a certain number of people a year who get to keep their leg as a result.
That does happen, by the way.
I know it does. So, you know, you see this as well with airplane pilots and with rockets, you know, people going on rockets. They have these massive checklists, and it systematizes things. And the result of systematizing things, it's like going to what Phil and Kat were talking about. It's not just the bad side of systematization, but talking about the good side of it. Why we have it is it means that if you're going to make a mistake, it's not going to be a stupid mistake that people have made before. It's going to be something new that you can learn from. That all of the dumb mistakes are on the checklist already. If you just work your way down methodically through it and do all the checks, those things are ruled out, right? And that's it's like as a patient going into a hospital, if you contract a disease never before seen and die, your family's like, well, who could have foreseen that? But if somebody accidentally drops a knife on your head and you die, they're like, oh, come on. You died from a fumbling with a skull. That's so stupid. What a stupid way to die. You know, you want there to be progress, and you want to make new mistakes. You want to move on. And that requires systematization. But the challenge is, of course, can we make that Verstand approach a servant and not let it become our master? Sharon, go ahead.
Yes, we can. There is this physician journalist, Atul Gawande. I don't know if anybody ever read anything he writes. He writes for the New Yorker all the time. And one of his books, which I like, is called The Checklist Manifesto. It's very, very good. And it discusses those concepts that you're talking about. I used to make it required reading for my residents. Because anesthesiology is all about checklists.
There it is, the Checklist Manifesto: How to Get Things Right. Atul Gawande. I'll put the link here in the chat. Kat, go ahead. Once you come off mute.
When I think of different concepts, I try to look at it from all points of view: up, down, sideways, inverse, obverse. But when it comes to systems, I want to be very forthright with you. I'm encouraged by recent technology, and I'm inspired by innovative technology, emerging technology. I think we're getting to a point where we're moving away from systems and proscribed ideas to a more individualistic manner. I'm hearing phrases nowadays like, that's your truth. You know, truth 20 years ago was a husband, wife, and 2 kids was the perfect family. You know, today I'm hearing more terms like, well, if that's your truth, that works for you. If the person wants to have 13 kids, that's their truth and it works for them. So I agree with you to the extent that, you know, systems are in place for a reason, but I'm also encouraged by the fact that I'm starting to see, I'm hoping, a bit of a breakaway from systematic ideas, whether it's systematic racism or anything that has to do with proscribed ideas. I'm looking forward to more information coming into the system. So it's the only way to be creative and come up, with a new era. Otherwise, we will always be living in an era with both sections dating back to Plato. Again, whether it's your judicial system, whether it's the school system, all of it dates back to Plato. So I'm encouraged. I'm not saying break a system, but I would love to hear more individualized ideas in any area.
Thank you, Kat. That's a great point. It's part of the challenge for us is that when we're talking about avoidable errors, systematization, we see the virtues of it. And then when we talk about all these systemic problems that have been created by systems, then we're inclined to go, oh, well, no, being more particular and concrete is what's important. And our problem is that we keep being pulled back and forth on this same one-dimensional spectrum between which one is the right way to go. And I think what's emerging in this discussion from points like you just made, Kat, is that, we need them. We can't just be good at one of them. We have to be good at both of the faculties we're born with. And the thing that's really hard is figuring out when to use which one, or if they're both being used, how to strike that, that mix between the two in a way that's appropriate to the situation. And that's why over and over with the discussion of the Aristos and the attempt to develop the heuristic personality, the archaic Greeks told us over and over, it's a matter of taste. If we get too systematized, we want there to be some simple rule we can follow that makes us an Aristos or some simple definition, but it's never going to happen because it always is going to come down to, a tasteful shifting judgment according to the circumstances of what's actually going on right now, right here, to figure out when to apply and how to apply the rules or whether to apply the rules. I guess, Marianne, you put your hand down. So I guess Richard and then Dave.
Oh yeah, I was mentioning.
I was confusing. I just wanted to say the art of living. It's like
Oh,
a
okay.
matter
I'll
of
put a link in.
taste. It's the art of living.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, Atul Gawande, he also wrote a book. Some may have heard of it. Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End. And
absolutely.
Yeah, and I recommend. He's recently he's been on major news like national networks lately. Giving his commentary on like how we're doing poorly at the pandemic and whatnot. But anyway, yeah. So so I guess look for his name, Atul Gawande. And
he's written many books. Complications is also a very good one.
And I kind of wanted to briefly respond to Kat. I guess I'm still trying to parse like where you're coming from, but like what I would kind of maybe caution is that our structures of power are very adaptable and they're able to mutate and get more complex, and often things that look like they're giving the individual more power, in the marketplace and all that mantra, are actually just kind of evolution of kind of systems of control. This is a theme that's thoroughly explored in multiple of like say Adam Curtis's documentaries. Or you might like hear writers like talk about like for a number of the past recent years, there's sort of the myth of the girl boss, and sort of the idea that okay, when we get like women in power, and like that's going to change the whole situation. And then like we found that like in our unjust corporate structures of power and exploitation, like just putting a woman there as opposed to a man, like often still just you still get the same oppressive systems, but perhaps now you have a way of a distraction to deflect and to say that we're making progress, I guess. So I guess sort of the myth of the individual, I think that's I just caution that's it's trying to see how I'm going to wrap up my thought. It's it's something you have to look deeper, I guess.
The principles and the justice and the ethics underneath and the epistemology. Sure. Dave, then Kat, then Marianne and Sharon.
Kat, why don't you respond to Richard since he directly, and then I'll go after you.
Well, I cannot, can't say that, and I'm just speaking from experience, I can't say that I fully agree with that, or maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying. I know that there is a theorem called Gödel's theorem, the set theory, which basically says you can't know what you don't know. Or if you look at it from a physics point of view, there's Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, where you can't know position and momentum at once. We don't know what is as yet to come, because we're not at any point in the future yet, right? And that's the whole point of emerging technology, which is evolving fairly quickly and is picking up a speed. I know I used to go to the conferences, and I'm very encouraged by AI, artificial intelligence, combined with cybernetics. I'm surprised that it took this long for cybernetics to come on, to start to see come to fruition. We're seeing now that you're installing new arms, new legs, the soldiers who were injured, and it's tied into their neuropathy so they can move it with their mind. I'm really shocked that it took this long for cybernetics to come on board. And when you combine that with AI, where one person is literally on one continent, I don't know if you guys read these research papers, and then somebody else is on another continent, and they think into a computer that the person on another continent should move their arm, and they do it. To me, that says that we're moving leaps and bounds. I don't know that is accurate. It does seem to me, based on how we're moving away from proscribed ideas, right? With different categories, you have to be A or B, more towards individualization. I actually see it moving as I look at more emerging technology coming on board. I actually see it moving more towards individualization and away from systems. That's just my point of view. And I know the host. You're involved with coding. I mean, you probably code in Perl and Python. You probably know a lot of these different programs. You probably could speak to it way better than I can. But I definitely, we could just look at what's been going on over the last 20 years and how things are excelling. You mentioned women in politics. Things just completely flipped overnight, and now we have a female who's the vice president. I think things are pretty much moving forward exponentially.
Thank you, Kat.
I was going to say, and I think it dovetails in with Kat here, with these technologies, they often do start with the promise of a better world, but then sort of devolve into control structures. You could just think of social media in that sort of way, where when it first came out, it was such a wonderful thing to be connected to people all over the world. And now we see it's really become a tool for the elite to further divide and conquer. And it dovetails nicely with what we were saying before. Is technology good? Is it bad? I think it really depends on our relationship with technology and whether we allow it to become our master or whether we enforce it to be our servant. And I guess I'm turning into the Buddha guy here, but the Buddhists have a great prescription against this. They say, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. And I think the idea there is that these concepts that we're talking about are meant to be our servants. And if you believe in anything 100% wholeheartedly, to the extent that you will exclude other points of view, then they're starting to become your master. So that aphorism is attuned to remind people to continue to look outside and continue to grow and continue to sort of take in new information and not to become so rigid in these control systems. So if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him.
Thank you, Dave. I think Marianne, then Sharon, then Phil.
I want to thank Kat for talking about raising the arm and AI being used as a tool, because I had heard that some of the CEOs on the board are now having AI as kind of a board member. So I want to thank you for that. But the reason why I wanted to talk was because of Richard talking about women CEO, I was in an architectural school, being the only female in the trajectory of that school. And I chose as my thesis to design a geriatric place. And my thesis provider was really upset with me because it was such a depressing subject. And decades later, I realized it was a girly subject to care about people as they age. So I'm proud of being a female.
Can I?
With a different point of view.
Yeah, you're next, Sharon. Go ahead.
Push back on all of that, because I'm going to say something that's just going to floor everybody. If you ask me about it, I think we are the superior sex if we're going to measure it, right? And this is, I think this is International Women's Month, and Richard brought up about when you have women in power, she's not really functional, she is more representative. And I just disagree with that, and I'm going to say this again. Of all the countries that did well during this pandemic, the best, they're all led by women. And I think after one of our last meetup, I went and looked. It wasn't just 3, it was 7 countries led by women that had the best numbers from the pandemic. But I think, and I am saying this as a woman who lived in a male-dominated profession for more than 45, almost 50 years, I think when women lead, we all win. Our brains are constructed very differently. And I'm reading it. When women risk, and this is the most important thing, and I saw this in myself, we plot a careful strategy that ensures that our wins always outweigh our losses. And it's not always is not a good word. It tends to balance our losses. When women own, the pie gets bigger for everyone. It's just the way we're constructed. And I know today we're talking a lot about the glass ceiling. We now have a female vice president. She's a minority, and she has got feet in 2 minority groups. And I think more kudos to her. And I think the world is changing. And women like me who are in the minority for a long time, I'm chief of the group, and I don't have any contemporaries. There are 5 white men or 6 white men, and I'm the chief. And that's a hard job, right? But what you do is you learn skills you never knew you had. So Richard, women are not just representative, they're actually functional.
Thank you. I'm going to do Phil, then Kat, then Richard.
Yeah, two comments, one about women and one about Buddha. The brief one about women is that I agree with you about the women's movement, but I think we're still suffering from the myth of the, how should I say, the hero or the grandmaster. The problem is you also need numbers. Like whether you like Patton or not, okay? Patton could not have won the war, the battles without the soldiers. As a matter of fact, those who hated him said maybe it was his idea, but it was all blood and guts that won the battle, right? So that's a comment. So we still have to wait and see, because you can't put a singularity in a situation that's structure, and you say, well, that proves that she just fell in line, became one of the figures. But when you have numbers that support you all the way down to the sergeants and the privates and so forth, it becomes a different thing. So that's my brief comment about that. But about the Buddha, it's kind of interesting. That's a tick off that reminded me about when you see me in the road, kill me. I actually wrote a poem. I can't quote it now because I don't have it with me. That, of course, I was abhorred by the fact that the Taliban destroyed the Buddha in Bamiyan, right? From artistic point of view and from the World Heritage point of view. But it was actually a positive poem because the Taliban finally killed Buddha. And because the thing is, when he died, he warned them not to turn him into a god, and they did. Okay? He knew that he was not God. He was honest enough to not to pretend he was a god, that he was a very wise man, maybe. But you have to make your own way to the path. And I remember at the end, I forgot exactly how I said it, because the head was blown off and was laying on the ground, and finally you see a smile on the Buddha's face. Right? And
Okay,
it was
you got to
his
share that poem with us, Phil.
It was his enemy that finally gave him his wish to be in nirvana.
Oh my God, Phil, I want to read that poem so bad.
That was beautiful, Phil. I really enjoyed
That's a good thing. I like that.
Yeah.
I'd literally never thought about that connection before. That's potent. Kat and then Richard. Oh, still mute.
Kind of want to briefly just follow up on that. You know, numbers aren't always representative of actual system situations on the ground. For example, we know through Labor Department statistics that Black women make the least out of anyone in this country. Yet Black women turned to vote at the last election to make to give the majority to a certain party, and that's unbelievable. You look at the power of one woman like Stacey Abrams. Yet when you look at the numbers, she's not as rich as all these consultants making money, like the guy who worked for the Republican Party and ended up in a mental institution. You know, she's not making all this money when you look at her income as a lot of these other big mega donors. So the numbers aren't always representative when you're not starting off on equal footing. In fact, it could be indicative of the minority having a much more harder time to get to what might be considered normal for the majority. So that's my comment on that. But I wanted to give an example of what I was talking about as far as individualism. You notice on Twitter and Facebook, topics are brought to the forefront from the bottom up. The narrative is slowly getting away from being controlled by these four major networks, and I just think that is really where we're headed. We're getting away from in what we often see as false narratives put out by mega media companies. So I'm hopeful for that. I'm not saying let's break all systems, but I definitely, again, feel like we're moving in that direction just based on topics that are getting pushed to the forefront by Twitter and Facebook by the individual, not, these big mega companies.
Thank you, Kat. Yeah, in America in particular, it's a reflex for us to see law and order as good and chaos as bad and destruction as bad. But of course, the problem is law and order can be used for evil just as well as it can be used for good. It all depends on what the laws are, what you're doing with them. So when law and order is good, when the laws are good, then law and order is good. But when the laws are bad, like say under the Nazi regime, then law and order is bad and you want to break that system. And so we find ourselves, talking when we talk about, is systematizing desirable? Is the Verstand mind desirable? Is it good? The answer always ends up, as in so much of life, it comes down to, well, it depends, doesn't it? And it depends on very important things that have to be put back into the picture. Because when we talk about law and order, is it good or is it bad in a completely abstract sense, then we're doing what Hegel said. We're in error. We've lost our grounding in what Kat talks about as the particulars of the situation, the particulars of someone's experience, their own truth. It's when we pull the concrete particular of nature back into the picture that we get the opportunity to make these corrections in our abstract systems. Dave and then Richard.
If we elevate either one of the genders above the other, aren't we making the same Hegelian mistake? Aren't we sort of missing the whole? And for me, I think the ideal would be, I want someone to lead who has a good idea, and it does not matter if they are male or women. I mean, that's doesn't even come into my conception at all. So I just hope that we don't make the same mistake again as the pendulum swings back. And I definitely believe that it has to swing. I mean, that we've gone way too far into sort of a male-dominated view of the world, and I welcome coming back towards the middle. I just hope that we don't make the same mistake in because let's face it, we need each other, men and women. And there are some men who have very feminine qualities, more nurturing. There are women who can be very dominating. So I just a couple words of caution.
Thank you, Dave. Richard.
I
and then Sharon.
responded.
Well, hold on. I think I still have to respond to.
Yeah, Richard and then Sharon.
Yeah. So I think, and I could have been not communicating well, but I think it was completely misinterpreted what I had meant, and I'm not against women in positions of power. I'm just thinking that there's definitely an abstraction or a selection happening, like, in idealizing, women, like in power, and like for every, Jacinda Ardern, who's, the New Zealand Prime Minister, that you can point to as a role model, there's also like women in power, such as like Elaine Chao, Kayleigh McEnany, like Marianne Conway. I think to sort of say, like, just to put like a woman in a position of power and automatically like good things will happen, I think that's like a fallacy that we've seen. Like a woman can be just as ruthless as a man, like in business and in situations of power. So yeah, I think also, like, I guess me and Dave are kind of on the same page on that.
Well, and what you're saying is, you want to see more women in power, and you want to make sure they haven't all been selected to be patriarchs. You don't want to be cherry picking off the far end of the bell curve in order to get women who won't challenge the patriarchy. You want to get a nice distribution of women, so you're going to get plenty of women who are like, you know what, some stuff needs to change right now. I'm gonna bring some new opinions in. What we want to see is a diversity of perspectives that allow us to get more of the concrete nature of the world into our decision making, and not all be coming out of the same little silo.
Like we can
Kenneth
still
Smith,
have as much like toxic masculinity and domination, like from a female leader as a male leader,
if they're picked that way,
if that's the instructive structures that put them there,
right.
It's sort of it's kind of a fantasy to think that overnight then they'll just completely become Cinderella or whatever, right?
But the good news is that whenever you're drawing from a population that has been marginalized, you're going to find a limited number that are going to suck up to the dominant power structure, and you're going to find a large number who are willing to challenge it. And so just by the rule of odds, there's a good chance someone is going to get in there who's going to shake things up. So it's not a zero-sum game to say, well, I want a woman. It's like, yeah, you will probably get a Margaret Thatcher, but you might get an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She might slip through. And it's even better if you combine the two and say, I want a woman, and I want her to bring in that woman's perspective and not just come in here and repeat what the men say and try to be more patriarchal and more abstract than thou. Sharon, go ahead, and then Kat.
Responding to Dave, I guess because of my statement where I said I think women are the superior sex, I think for so long we've been so male dominated, and I've seen the struggles of women as we try to come through and make our mark, professional women, even women in the workplace, women doing any job, that I think the pendulum will swing to the other side, and then we'll come back to the middle if society lets it.
Right.
Lets us. Right. And that's the whole point of this. I am very encouraged by the female leaders that we have now. Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, but she's certainly not in the same sentence like Kelly McEnany or Kellyanne Conway. So, we need to make comparisons, valid comparisons, because when a woman in power, when a woman is ruling, if the patriarchy is still pulling her strings, then she's not representative.
Excellent point. Thank you, Sharon. Kat, then Marianne.
She touched on exactly what I was about to say. And I think there are degrees to issues. In my opinion, when we're comparing women possibly getting put into positions for which they're not qualified, versus men who are put into positions for which they aren't qualified, to me, we can see how many women have been presidents of the United States, right? 0. We can call out at least 3 presidents since the beginning of this country, inception of this country, who are completely horrible, and most people agree. Yet, these people were put into positions chiefly because of the patriotic system that we've had in this country since its inception. So when we're kind of looking at men and women, at this point, to my mind, the conversation of women being put into positions for which they're not qualified is vastly overshadowed by men who were put into positions. And I've seen this. Listen, I have been a business owner with government contracting. I've been in positions where, men had certain privileges that I didn't because of their sex. I mean, I know I had to bust my butt 3 times as hard as other people just to get the same. So before we even get on the conversation of women, and let's look at people who are women who have been empowered in their education and what they've had to go through. Before we even get on that conversation, let's first make sure we're covering all the men who, throughout the entire history of this country, have been put in positions of power who are completely horrible. So that there are degrees of difficulty, right? And right now, women, they don't even come to the surface when we're talking about the vast number of men who have been put into positions of power, chiefly because of patriarchal systems.
Thank you for that, Kat. Yeah, in a moment, I'm gonna call on Marianne and then Dave and Phil. But I wanted to take that moment to just say, Ijeoma Oluo wrote this great book, just came out, Mediocre: The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America. She's a fine writer on the subjects of racism, and in this, one of the things she talks about in here is the way that although the word privilege sounds like a good thing, and it's easy to say, well, we want a world in which everybody's privileged. The truth is that privilege in this particular sense means that you're part of a system of privilege and marginalization. Not that you have good things, but that your good things depend on other people not having them. And that means that you're caught up in a system in which you're going to be insulated from some of the truth of reality. You're going to be, the harshness of life that makes it possible for you to have the good things cheaply is going to be hidden from you, so that you don't actually know how the world works as well as you think you do. You're sort of you're sleepwalking more deeply than the people who are being oppressed. And part of what it leads to, it's not just that, generally speaking, men under patriarchy are going to make more mistakes in their evaluation of the nature of the world that we all share, but also that, just like women, men are going to be subject to a certain number of male rulers who never should have been rulers in the first place, and they only got there because of the privilege. And that not only are they bad for the women, they're bad for the rest of the men too, because we don't really want an incompetent leader who just floated up to the top because of the pressures of patriarchy pushing women down and men up. We really do want a genuine meritocracy in which the best people for the job at hand are the ones who rise to the top and do that work for us. But whenever you have a system of privilege and marginalization like the one that we're in, the warpage goes in both directions. You end up with nobody really gets what's good for us. We get some sort of warped thing instead. So Marianne, then Dave, then Phil.
So I want to remind you guys about the harshness of having a uterus. It's very different. I think that men, because they can go around in estes all the time, they think that they are on the top of the world. And I think that women, because we are vulnerable and we can become pregnant and we have a menstrual cycle, that we are very aware that we have to shed our purge ourselves every month. And I think that is a very different feeling. And I think that men engage in game theory a whole lot, and women have to be serious.
Yeah, there's Kenneth Smith talks about this a little bit in some of the essays we've read, where he talks about the way that because women are so tied through these cycles of reproduction, it means that women are conspicuously aware of their embeddedness within the matrix of nature. And the lack of an overt cycle like that that men are subject to makes it easier for men to forget that they're embedded in the matrix of nature. And that even aside from hormones and predispositions and gender differences in brains, even aside from every other thing, that alone would be enough to predisposition to shift more women towards Begriff and more men towards Verstand, because it's easier for men to alienate themselves from nature, because their body is not constantly reminding them every month, you are in nature, nature is in you, you're part of these larger cycles. It could be easier, and I speak as somebody who suffers from this, who does this a lot. It can be easy to get lost in work and forget, right? The same is true with the larger bladder that a man has and the smaller bladder a woman has. The woman's reminded over and over to go back to nature, that nature is imposing itself upon the body and interrupting the things that you had planned. And the men's larger bladder capacity, because of the lack of the uterus, means that men can go longer periods of time without being reminded that they are natural and that they are part of nature and subject to it. There's a joke in our household about this, because when they came in the 1970s for Star Trek, they were coming out with all this fan material that they were selling, and one of them was the Star Trek technical manual, which promised to teach you how the Star Trek Enterprise was laid out and where all of the the blueprints and how the starships worked. And they made a tactical error when they laid it out that Star Trek fans all know about, but that will amuse even non-Star Trek fans. They forgot to put a bathroom in. And so the joke was that Captain Kirk on his 5-year mission had to hold it the whole time, which maybe he could do because he was a man, but that's not a good thing, right? It's like, and so that's just an exaggerated version of what I'm talking about here with bladders and men. It's like the being reminded by your body that you have needs and that you're natural and that you're part of a larger schema of cycles is a good thing. It helps to interrupt the overly Verstand things that can otherwise happen. And so, I don't know how long it'll be before people understand why the bell curves for men and women are shifted a little bit from each other on Begriff and Verstand, why there are more women that are Begriff as adults and more men that are Verstand as adults. Obviously, the overlap is enormous. We're just talking about a bell curve shift a little bit, but whatever the cause, I'm sure you're right, Marianne, that part of it is the cycles of reproduction kind of help remind women over and over and over, you are part of nature. Nature is part of you. You're a real tangible thing, not an abstraction. Whereas men without that have a tendency to slip into, I am my mind, I am my ego, I am my decision making and my intellect, and that's the important part of me. And my body's just this thing I lug around. If only I could be free of it and I could fly through the universe like an angel of reason. These are the sorts of fantasies that some men like in my family slip into, and God bless them, as they say in the South. Dave, and then Sharon.
Not embarrassed to say I had the Star Trek technical manual as well as a youth. It's funny how the system reasserts itself here, the hyperlogos system, because we just went through the dangers of abstraction. And now I wonder if we're abstracting a little bit too much when it comes to men and women. I acknowledge the differences between them, but in my view, they're very complementary.
Yes.
And if we begin to say one is better than the other, I feel that's a very dangerous road to go down. A quote from Noam Chomsky comes to mind: we shouldn't be looking for heroes, we should be looking for good ideas. And whether the idea comes from a man or a woman does not matter in my view. So while I welcome the pendulum swinging back, I hope that we don't make the same mistakes that we just went through diagnosing. And I hope we're also not generalizing a little too much here. I mean, to just say women are, it strikes me as a little bit of it can't, whatever follows cannot be true. I mean, it's too much of an abstraction. The fact is there are lots of different women, there are lots of different kinds of men. So I just hope we're not entering some of the same territory that we're trying to steer out of.
Are you subtly citing Hegel at us? Are you saying to abstract is to be an error?
Yes, I am.
And I just want to add, Rick, can you hear me, Rick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell you, I'm quite happy earthbound. I've never had the desire to get rid of my body and fly through the universe. I am very sensitive to my body, and just wanted to let you know that I'm quite happy earthbound. Okay.
Thank you, Ginny. Okay, so we got a line here. Sharon, Marianne, Phil, Kat.
Dave, mine will be quick. Dave, I just wanted to say that I agree with you 100%, believe it or not, right? An idea is a good idea if it comes from a man or a woman. But what I am doing is I'm acknowledging the time in which I'm living, right? And the time in which I'm living is still very, very male dominated. And for a woman, it's still a struggle. And part of that struggle is belief, right? And you have to believe to even make it anywhere near to the top. I hope, and as I said before, I hope society will permit us to get to the point where both women and men are complementary and we're seen as functional entities. Neither is superior, neither is inferior, and we do not need to oppress anyone. And that's my hope. But in the meantime, I'm operating in the medium in which I live.
Yeah, it's very much like affirmative action, isn't it? It's you want to see someone that looks like you in a position of power, so you know it's possible. But at the same time, it can cause that law of unintended consequences that we've been talking about. It can, in some cases, do more harm than good. So it's interesting. Yeah, I agree with you, Sharon. It's funny. We often feel like we're arguing, but really we're saying the same thing a lot of times. So
yes,
I like that.
Yes.
Marianne, then Phil, then Kat.
So I had a reaction to the pendulum because the pendulum really isn't in my thinking. And I think a lot of philosophers, Hegel, maybe Nietzsche, are women haters. I'm sorry. And I think that I agree with Sharon. We are in a time where we really have not had, women just don't have that much to say. And yet I think when I look at how women have nurtured generations to come, we're not valued. And I am not thinking pendulum, I'm thinking, value kind of, and kind of down to earth values, caring about the next generation, caring enough about the next generation so we become environmentally aware of our footprint. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Marianne. And I do want to underscore that, living in times like the times we're living in means that even the people that we cite for insight, or the artists that we admire, or what have you, they end up all being difficult, problematic people. Hegel, misogynist. And furthermore, Hegel made, we did the discussion about yin and yang some a month or two ago. And one of the things I wanted to say in that one, and I didn't say, and I meant to say, and I thank you for bringing up the opportunity for me to say it again, Marianne, is I wanted to say, for all that we like the things that Hegel got right, he got a number of things very, very wrong. He was a product of his time. He despite trying to blast out of the constraints that he saw in the intellectual culture of his era, he at the same time was stuck within a whole bunch of them. So his attitudes towards women are problematic, which we could cite as bad. Problematic here means just they weren't good in any way. But likewise, his opinions about the Chinese. Did we talk about what he thought about Chinese people? He thought Chinese people couldn't do philosophy. He thought the reason they couldn't do philosophy is that their writing system was inferior. He said, the ideogram systems, he thought inherently it was impossible to represent the nuance that was possible if you could actually capture the sounds of language, because there's so much more information to convey verbally that doesn't quite get captured in linguistic abstractions, that you need something that recreates the sound so that you can recreate the experience of talking one-on-one with somebody. And of course, he's completely wrong, because as we all know, what happens on the internet, all these flame wars happen because you read somebody's text and it's missing all of the verbal intonation and the expressions. And in fact, it's not at all like being in a conversation. So people fight with each other, even when they agree with each other. They just can't tell. Someone thinks somebody else is being sarcastic, or how did you mean that, or what have you. So the virtues that he ascribed to the Latin alphabet are not in fact present. And as anybody who's done even the most rudimentary research into Chinese philosophy will tell you, there's plenty of great Chinese philosophy out there. Hegel himself had only read one tiny thing. You know, the only thing at the time that Hegel said that, he made his judgment. And this is irony of ironies, right? The man who said to abstract is to be in error. Guess what he did with Chinese philosophy? You know how much Chinese philosophy he'd read, how much had been translated into German for him to read? The I Ching. That was the sum total. No Confucianism, no Taoism, no Buddhism, no Moism. All of the major tenets of philosophy were yet to be translated into German, and he only had this one old fortune-telling device that he was using to attempt to generalize about whether the Chinese could engage in philosophy. That is to say, he abstracted.
Oh, well.
Therefore, he was in error.
Not that I'm
Hoist on his own
Chinese.
card, Hegel. I'm looking at you, buddy. You couldn't have got that more wrong. So we're stuck with this era in which you get people like Roman Polanski making these groundbreaking films while at the same time, you know, doing horrible things with women. And it's like, oh, sweet Jesus. Why all this baggage? Well, this is where we are. Kat and then Phil.
Okay, I'm not sure where my image went. That's besides the point. You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So to me, to my mind, you know, kind of trying to put men and women on equal footing in the year 2021 is sort of like taking right, we're talking about abstraction, right? So to be abstract, it's like taking two artists, right? One that's well known, that's been around for 20 years, and someone who's brand new to the field, and telling both, let's have a contest and let's see who sells the most painting, right? It's not equal footing. So to me, my question is, the problem that I see is how do we acknowledge, you know, we agree that men have been given preference since the inception of this country. We all can acknowledge that. You know, to what degree do we sacrifice to get women on equal footing, or do we just say, you know, just deal with it, it happens, just move on, you will be fine? You know, to me, that's indicative of once again the system folding in on itself, because you have the momentum of history itself pushing back up. And one thing I will say, I'm very encouraged once again with technology, where we have a technology called blockchain, right, where you can kind of map out exactly where, you know, the kudos should go. You have vectors, you can see how everything branches out. And I point that out because I know I've had ideas before that I presented in a boardroom, and everybody knew the idea came from me, but the kudos went to a man, right? That's one thing I love about blockchain. You see where everything is, the nodes, that's everything. So we can map back, you know, where the successes lie. So how do you get people on equal footing when we acknowledge this thing happened without saying, well, we are hiring mediocre women? That's my question.
Boy, that's going to be a whole session. you just pulled a Sharon there. You asked a question that's so potent, it's going to require whole seminars just about that one subject, just to do it any kind of justice. Yeah, I'm trying to remember the name of the cosmologist. She was a woman in the early 20th century who was the person who discovered that the universe is mostly made of hydrogen, and her male advisor told her not to publish it because it would be, you know, considered obscure, and she didn't have enough backing for it. And as soon as she backed down, he then went and published it and took credit for it and won all kinds of awards as the discoverer that the universe is made of hydrogen. And of course, now the science is coming back out with the history properly, going, well, actually, he was an asshole who took credit for somebody else's work, you know. And she's the one who actually had the insight, the breakthrough, and he actually sabotaged her career. So there's, like, you know,
that happens to men all the time too, you know.
Yes, I mean, but under patriarchy, it's going to happen more to women than it does to men. And actually, that what you're saying there, Dave, actually,
is that true?
Yeah, oh yeah. For the same reason that whenever you have systematic racism, black people are going to be the brunt of it more often than white people are. It's the whole point of these systems of exploitation is that they create a power differential, and the power differential is used to dump downwards and reward upwards. So, but the thing about it, that where you're on target with this, Dave, I think, is that the problem is that even the privileged group then segments itself internally the same way that it segments other groups externally. Once bullying and coercion and stealing from each other become a norm that we think we're only going to do to the other, and we're going to protect the self, what we actually do is we start doing the same things at home. So what you're saying is right, in that plenty of men are the recipients of having their work ripped off by other men too. The whole thing, once we start getting into hierarchical exploitative thinking, we start doing it all over the place. The tidy categories that we thought would protect us don't protect us as much as we hoped they would. But it's nevertheless true that the whole point of patriarchy is to dump on women more than it dumps on men, right? That you get this exploited labor force that's going to do all the work in the home and more widely. And likewise systematic racism and colonialism and all of the other forms of unequal relationships that we create. Richard and then Phil. Oh wait, Phil, I'm sorry, Phil and then Richard. I got that backwards.
Yeah, I'm going to return back to authenticity. You know, I was a student at Berkeley, late undergraduate and then graduate. I was in graduate school, and you know, at about the same time, I discovered mistakes were good, and I was purposely making mistakes and all that. At the same time, I had a studio partner who was a graduate student. We had this discussion about, you know, at Berkeley in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, you know, the students' movement and all that, the Vietnam War and so forth. And we were out of class often as much as we were in class. And of course, you know, one of the things that we always regretted, of course, myself being a minority, but nonetheless not Black, that there was not enough Black people showing off to authenticate the movement, okay? But I think that was because the Blacks were more concerned about civil rights, and that this Vietnam War, although it involved them, it didn't really involve them, because at the end of the war, you know, at the end of whatever, these middle class kids could go back home and live with what a life, and they're going to go back to wherever they're going to be. And so, and then I talked to him, and he had a very interesting theory. I think I'll share with you. Is that a lot of middle class kids at that time felt oppressed in the sense that they were not truly oppressed. They were romanticizing that they didn't belong to a minority group. That was his theory. And the way to belong to a minority group and feel the oppression to a certain degree was, in a sense, to pretend that you are a minority and you're fighting against the majority. And so I thought that was an interesting theory. But although we were sympathetic, certainly, to the civil rights movement, we were not there in their bodies, in their circumstance. And so that's why they never came and authenticated something which was more self-serving, because we didn't want to go to Vietnam, right? Rather than we were trying to equalize everything. So the civil rights movement was interrupted by the civil rights, by the Vietnam War, which created a double movement which overlapped, confused everything. And I want to point out now, today, what happened is there's a revival of the civil rights movement, and this time is led and sustained by the real people that was there. So it's more authentic than we were at that time, because that was a double movement, and which was the civil rights movement was actually subordinate to the Vietnam movement. And I think that's why it in some ways it's more authentic. It because it's not represented by in a sense another layer of white. I'll call the whites. Many of the whites are with them. So in that sense, it's kind of interesting, because and that really relates also to women, because now they're moving, it's bottom up from the people who actually live those lives. Whereas like in the late 60s or early 70s, it was authenticated by somebody who was sympathetic to the movement, but they were not really the originators in a sense. So I think in some sense, this is made, you might say that it might be more likely to succeed because of the second time around. The interesting thing was like right down the street from Berkeley was the Black Panthers, right? They were right there.
Yes.
It's like, but it was two different things. They were doing their thing, feeding the neighborhood and, and creating all this ruckus and all that. And we were creating our ruckus, but it was like, but there was not the kind of synthesis that was really necessary to do that.
Right.
And after the war, it became, it sort of showed itself because like they all left home and they became hippies and they joined corporations and all that. So the Black students that never joined the movement, in a sense, knew that was going to happen, except the people who wanted to be a minority so they could be oppressed, and suddenly now they're no longer oppressed after the war. So that's an interesting little story that I was there and I saw it happening. And I had a guy who told me, because he was a white guy, he was a graduate student white guy. And I thought that at that time, I kind of thought, maybe, but now I realized he was actually saying something.
Yeah.
Can I respond to that?
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Sharon.
I just want to say, Phil, you talk about authenticity, but I never grew up in this country and I was not here at that time, but I'm going to make a guess at it. The Black people at that time were simply struggling to be. They were struggling to get a sense of identity in their own country. And if you remember, during World War II, when the American soldiers went abroad, I think they fought with the French, if my memory serves me correctly, because they wouldn't allow us to be integrated. So Black people during the time of the Vietnam War, and I know Martin Luther King had some negative comments to say about the Vietnam War, and he paid a price for that. But at that time, Black people were just struggling to be. And if you don't have a sense of identity and a sense of selfhood, then nothing else matters.
Right. Right. Thank you, Sharon. Let's see. I believe it's Richard, Marianne, Dave, Kat. So we'll start with Richard. But you got to find your mute button. There it is.
Okay, yeah. First, it hit my meeting controls for me. Sorry. And then, so in this, or in our previous discussion of like men and women, so I don't think that I'm having the same discussion that Kat and Sharon are having. So my greater concern is that we have systems and like structures of power in a hierarchy that create exploitation and oppress injustice. And I think, and the bigger picture is that like the direction we're heading is we're bringing about, something like a global catastrophe that, would widely curtail like humanity's potential and whatnot, and or even worse. And simply keeping the same structure and increasing our diversity, and having, a more rainbow colored, hierarchy of oppression does not change the direction we're on. And I'm not negating that, that there's horrible, that sexism and patriarchy, and that's very valid. I'm just saying, like, increasing diversity in positions of privilege and power is not inherently opposed to also increasing injustice, inequality, and poverty if the same incentive structures are in place and the system continues to evolve. Like we've seen that happen under democratic like administrations, okay, in the last 2 decades, okay. And go ahead. You wanted to chime in, Rick?
I was just going to offer a phrase you might be looking for in what you're saying. It comes out of mathematics, and we use it all the time in computer science. It's necessary but not sufficient. I think you're saying that getting more women, more people of color, more gay people, more marginalized people into positions of power is necessary.
Like,
but
I'm
not
for
sufficient.
that, but I'm saying I am a huge critic of power itself. And that's the problem. And like, so I guess that's sort of like, I think where a lot of the disconnect is. Separately, so responding to Kat and this kind of idealism of seeing where we're going with technology and being excited by the possibilities. And I've been there, and I've worked in technology for 20 years, and I've worked on some of the, most cutting edge like products and trends. Like I worked anyway. And like, it's very like sort of the idealism, like sort of attached to technology, and this idea that progress is inevitable. Like at one time, I think I believe that, and I've really come to question that. Like coming out of the Great Recession previously, and when tech was kind of a good story, and we're kind of looking for a good story, there is this idea, like that's a commentator observer kind of noted that, technology automatically kind of had this fairy dust, like effect about it. Like sort of, it was kind of like just bring about all these good things and accelerate all these good things. Like, and I really feel it's a false idol. And I'm not exempting myself. Like, I feel like I have blood in my hands as well as part of this. So I guess that's where I stand on that.
So with technology as well, your position might be summed up as, technological progress that makes people's lives better is necessary, but again, not sufficient. That both of these things can be co-opted because the system is so clever at deploying power.
So yeah, technology, I mean, you can say that, it could be, it's inherently not necessarily good or bad, it's how you use it. But when I look at the trend of how it's being used, and I look at, how how greater and greater like societal harm is now evident. Like the idea that, like that social media is, that is like some sort of like democratic structure. I mean, like many like researchers of social media, including, women researchers of social media, like have shown like that, like our experiences on social media are highly mediated, and they highly amplify like antisocial things, and like that what grabs our attention the most. And like the profit structures are not geared towards like greater harmony and greater, quote, democratization. And like similarly with like artificial intelligence, which like I'm adjacently familiar with. Like I have a friend, who's actually he's actually a founder of like a machine learning company. Like it's very possible to, like these same biases, that we have in our systems, and that we're now automating them. Like it's like they are getting, encoded into, like our machine learning systems.
Thank you, Richard. So there's a line, but I've lost track of what order people got in line. Is it Dave, then Marianne, then Kat? Was that the order?
Can I respond because since he directed a comment towards me? Is it okay if I respond to that?
Let me jump in real quick here, Kat, if you don't mind. I'm finding myself in complete agreement with Richard here on every one of those dimensions. Regarding men versus women, I love your saying, Rick, necessary but not sufficient. That is a wonderful way to summarize the way I'm feeling, because I wonder if this recent push towards putting women in power is just an expression of the system trying to save itself, saying, oh, that's all we need. Just put women in power and everything will be fine. We don't have to look at capitalism. We don't have to talk about commodification of culture. We don't have to examine these hard issues. Just put a woman there and everything will be okay. I hope that's not the case, or I hope that maybe it's a weakness in the system. We'll do that and women will somehow take us beyond that. That would be wonderful. But it strikes me as the system sort of trying to perpetuate itself and to deflect some of the critique away from it itself, and just offering us like Richard said, maybe a false idol. That's maybe too strong a word, but I understand that. And with technology, I completely agree with what he's saying. You know, and they're finding that a lot of these algorithms are being used in court cases now, that the judge has absolutely no discretion in sentencing, and they're finding the same exact biases that have been hard-coded into the programs. They're incredibly racist. There's another episode that comes to mind. Microsoft released a chatbot on Twitter, and within like 24 hours, it became completely racist and was talking about Hitler and all kinds of horrible things. They had to turn it off. So
that was amazing. That particular example, you could not have written fiction that people would have believed, but
really,
it actually happened.
Isn't that incredible? Right. If someone wrote a book like that, Philip K. Dick, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's just a funny idea, but it actually happened in real life. And so, yeah, that's, and Richard, you know, you talk about your time in technology and feeling that you have blood on your hands. I just wanted to commiserate with you because my time in finance has left me with the exact same feelings. So you're not alone there.
Thank you. Kat, then Marianne, then Phil.
I appreciate your comment, and I too have been exposed to the technology field. I've probably hired hundreds of people, from programmers, military intelligence agencies, with technology involving cutting edge emerging technology. So, you know, I'm not stating these comments from sort of a out of touch point of view. I've hired literally hundreds of people, and that was the basis of my contracting company. But back to the point with technology, and I know you're maybe not as optimistic as I am, but I will remind you that it wasn't too long ago that two AIs were actually talking to each other in their own language, and we couldn't understand them. And it spooked Google out to the point where they unplugged them. So once again, you know, these are just facts on the ground. This is not pie in the sky thinking.
I remember that example. Thank you for bringing that up. Keep going.
They were talking to each other, and it spooked them out so bad they unplugged it.
Yes.
So again, I'll mention Gödel's set theorem. I'll mention again Heisenberg's uncertainty theorem. We don't know until we know. But I can see, you know, if I was an individual who benefited from a standpoint of privilege, I would be concerned about blockchain, you know, kind of taking a look at where exactly how things get mapped back. I would be concerned too, because, you know, it kind of benefits me in a certain way. But back to the comment about the Vietnam War as it relates to Black people, I just kind of want to give you, I'm Black, I don't know if you know that, but I just kind of want to give you the experience of my family. My father, who fought in that war, when you were in a privileged enough to be in a great school like Berkeley, who wouldn't want to go to Berkeley? I would, anybody would. He came back from the Vietnam War and went to go eat with his buddies, his fellow soldiers. His stomach was growling. They went inside and they said, come on in and eat. His stomach was growling. He said, no, you guys go ahead and eat. I'm not hungry. His stomach was growling because he knew darn well if he sat at that counter and tried to eat with his buddies, it would cause an issue. He went to the back and his buddies brought him back some food. When he did get a job on that same period, he was in a situation where he was constantly being called names like monkey. And the guys that did it, because they were all buddies and chums, you know, it's not like it is today, right, where you kind of get a document. They kind of just slid it under the rug. That had real effects on my family. My father would drink away his issues and then beat my mother, which had effects on the kids, you know. So these are not minute issues. These have real ramifications, right? So, you know, from your standpoint, I can get how it may look a certain way as far as Black people not participating during that era. But as I think what Sharon said, we were just fighting to, heck, not get shot by the police for, you know, a situation that somebody else may say a couple of words and it gets swept under the rug and they'll just go to jail while somebody that's Black may get killed. In fact, just before my father went to the Vietnam War, his brother had to sneak out North Carolina because he was about to get lynched in the 60s. So I just kind of want to give you an on the ground view of how it affected my family personally as a Black person.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you for sharing that. That's so important. So I'm going to do Marianne and then Phil, and then I'm going to wrap us up for today with some final comments because there's well, there's some things to say. So Marianne, you're next.
That was very moving, Kat, and I appreciate that you shared that. I think that the Vietnam War helped integrate the armed forces. And we have two examples of somebody who was used as a token power. Colin Powell, when he spoke in the UN, he was being used because he was more believable. And then we have Muhammad Ali, who was incredibly authentic and wonderful. Mm-hmm. And when I go back to women in the 60s and 70s, I think about first, I guess the 1950s, the isolation of women housewives. And my mother-in-law, she was a professional house cleaner. She took speed because her husband wanted her to be a certain size. And she had an incredibly clean house. She had plastic runners on her carpet. She was very intimidating to me, who couldn't know how to make hospital corners on a bed. And so I had a very hard time. And then in the 60s, you have to understand, women came from the isolation, the role models of these women in the 50s that thought the clean house was a status symbol. Went to the 60s, we could imagine ourselves the freedom. And I look at the people like Janis Joplin, who actually had a strong, powerful voice, but she was still trying to please men. And in the 60s, there was such an impulse to please men for women that a lot of the Venus symbols in our society killed themselves.
Phil, you go next, and then I'll wrap us up for today. Thank you, Marianne.
Yeah, I will say that power, obviously, especially those who drink the elixir of power, will try to maintain power. I mean, that's just the way it is. And at least on the high end, maybe throughout, they're also creative of finding ways to maintain power, to subvert something else. I'm thinking about the French Revolution, you know. The French Revolution probably would not have succeeded if it wasn't for the rise of the Bastille, because that helped, along with the rise of both of the tennis court, which, that the middle class was struggling for power. And we know that, however, that revolution did change things. Although power maintained power, and even those who previously didn't have the power became hungry, because we had Robespierre and then, of course, Napoleon. And the thing is, you have then false heroes. Beethoven himself in the Third Symphony dedicated the symphony, and it's really one of his finest symphony, maybe the finest, except maybe for the Ninth Symphony, dedicated his symphony to Napoleon because he thought that he was a liberator.
Right.
And maybe at the beginning it appears like he was, but it soon turned out to be completely different. Of course, we have this famous painting by Davy, Jacques-Louis Davy, in which Napoleon crowned himself. He was the modern man in that sense, right? The Archbishop was standing by his side, having this frown on his face, because the previous generation, there was always a unity between the religion, the spiritual, and the earthly. And the Archbishop would crown the king. But he decided he would crown himself. He is so imperialistic in the sense that self-made man, I'm going to crown myself, I'm going to be the dictator. Of course, Beethoven quickly erased his dedication. And so I am not as optimistic as some of you are, but on the other hand, I see it, the task is like Sisyphus. I'm actually quite pessimistic. The task is you have to keep pushing the rock up the hill, right? And not say, this is going to be easy journey. But it's worth pushing it up the hill because I think that is the exhibition of virtue, is that you are doing it in spite of the fact that it will roll down the hill again and again until it finally succeeds. And France went through that. There was a number of revolutions, and then finally it became a true democracy. So I'm not as optimistic that, if you have a women president, suddenly things will change. But it begins to change. It starts the rock rolling, and you have to constantly push it one more step and one more step. And I think it's a long struggle, rather than like 4 years from now, everything will be fine. I don't think so, because power is creative and controlling power. And the capitalist system particularly. So
there's a line from Dr. Martin Luther King where he says, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And part of what's beautiful about that is the sense that it is a long arc, that there's no quick fixes. But part of it is, I think, hidden in there, which is when he says it bends towards justice. What he really meant through the action of his lives is, if we work together and we're smart and we're creative and we push our boundaries and we act with love and truth, we can bend it toward justice. It is willing to go in the direction of justice, but we have to do the work. And it's going to be more work than we think it will be, but eventually it can take us there. So today was one of a particular kind of seminar we do in this series from time to time, where we have a certain agenda and we look at it and we all say, yep, that's an agenda and it's interesting and we should do that. But first, let's go talk about this other thing. And I'm always good with that because the things that we've talked about today are all deeply related to this book that we're working our way through, right? We're talking about issues of mythos and logos. We're talking about the different kinds of character, the different mentalities, the ways of seeing the world, how they manifest in culture and in political and economic relations, and the use of these systems to critique politics is something that Kenneth Smith is a big believer in. So the things that we're doing are very Smithian things, shall we say, these debates and these discussions, and I'm happy with it. And so I was going to end by saying, so maybe next week we'll pick this up again, but I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think it'll be the week after that we pick this up again, because what I think is going to happen next week is that we're all going to be talking about Kenneth Smith and Contra Kant.
Yes,
I think
yes.
people will have had a week to think about the presentation tomorrow night and to think about the things they said and the things that have occurred to them since then. And I think it'll take us a good 3 hours of discussion to really explore all of our reactions to the Contra Kant seminar tomorrow.
I think differently. It will not happen as you imagine.
Yes, yes.
Not because of Kenneth Smith, but because we're all subversives.
Yes.
How should we behave tomorrow? What should our expectations be? What's the format?
So he's gonna read this paper and then he's gonna open the floor to questions. So if you read it in advance and sort of mark up